Hello. I think we're
Hi.
live. Our
Yeah.
third episode on the Cryptid History Uncrypted. How are you doing tonight, Rachel?
I'm doing amazing. I'm super excited for this episode because all of them are good, I think, but this one I think is we're going to get into some of the really juicy stuff that I
Yes.
think everybody's been wanting to hear about. So buckle up, everybody. It's going to get weird in a good way.
Definitely gonna get weird. I just did a live stream this weekend with Jay Dyer and his wife Jamie, and we went over the conspirators hierarchy, the Committee of 300. And
Yeah.
I didn't realize, like, I haven't read this in a really long time, but I read Coleman's Tavistock book, and he talks so much about Tavistock in this one also. So, yeah, that was interesting to see.
Yeah, you guys, I love the three of you guys together. It's so fun for me, especially because I'm friends with all you guys. But to get the three of your brains together is always super exciting. So if you guys haven't seen that one, go check out that episode with the three of them that they just did, because I think it's like going to be a classic episode, you know?
I think so. I think it's a classic book. And I think it's interesting because it's one of those books that a lot of people were very critical of just because he doesn't have a whole lot of sourcing. And,
Yep.
but it turns out that it was very prophetic. And so he's kind of being vindicated, I think. But
Yeah.
he was definitely one of the people who like sent me down the rabbit hole. And the thing I try to explain to people, and I know that they hate seeing that it's like a, you know, when you start out saying, well, it's not very well sourced, it's like they immediately just like discredit it. But
Yeah.
what they don't realize is that he was MI6. This is not to say that he's like, that you should take everything he says face value or that he's 100%, correct in everything he says. But when they go in, and I know this from like friends of mine who are former intelligence, they get access to libraries that the masses can't go to. But what
Yeah.
happens is they can't take pictures, they can't take books out, they have to take notes or retain from memory. And then as they're walking, they have like essentially like a handler that goes around with them, and their notes get redacted. So they'll actually cross out notes that they take. And so then they're basically left with whatever notes they can take out and whatever they have, they can recollect from memory. So, again, that's not to say that it's going to be, everybody's memory is valuable at some point, even people who have like a perfect photographic memory. You can't 100% trust that. It's still their subjective response. But that's, largely, I think, what happens. And so he's integrating years and years of experience, both from intelligence sources as well as from the libraries that he has access to, as well as his own personal experience, because he actually interacted with these people. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think it's just now that so much has come to fruition, I think it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I think so too. So if you guys haven't seen that, go check it out. Is it on your Rumble? Is that where they should go to watch that episode?
Oh,
Or is it
that
just on
episode
Jay's?
is the first half is on Jay's YouTube, and then the second half is on his website and his Rockfin channel.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So,
Well, we have some great stuff for you guys today
yes.
in this third installment of our series on the founding of psychology. And Courtney's got a whole bunch of good stuff on Tavistock. I've got some crazy stuff on the early sexologists and psychological warfare guys. And all of it, of course, is intertwined and will connect. All of our stuff connects together. So it should be fun. Last time we left off right around World War I. So we're gonna start back up right around there. We're at the beginning of the 20th century. We now have established places in Germany and America that are studying psychology and psychiatry. You've got Freud and Jung and all of their influence in their circles. And right around this time is when investors start to take notice of the field of psychology and decide to put a bunch of money into it. So we're going to talk a little bit about who funded things and why they funded things and what they did with it too. So
Yeah.
do you want me to just start?
Yeah, I'm like, where should we start?
Well, I was going to start with Magnus Hirschfeld because he's right
Okay.
at the beginning of the century. And everything else I have ties into Tavistock and Rockefeller. He's the
Okay.
only thing, he kind of does too, but he's the only thing that's a little bit tricky. And the reason why If you guys don't know who Magnus Hirschfeld was, he was a Jewish psychologist based in Germany, who had the first Institute for Sexology. It was like a clinic, but it kind of crossed the lines of being a clinic and being like almost a halfway house for people who were various types of sexual deviants. Transvestites is what he called them at the time. He coined that phrase. He also coined the phrase transgender. And he himself was gay. And so there's just a lot going into that. And it's difficult to know where he got all his funding and support from, because the story is that the Nazis destroyed it all. Now, I'll get into why I have some questions about that in a minute. But I'm starting with him because his work had this huge impact on what we are dealing with right now with the whole what is a woman gender question, right? He's really the person that initiated all of this, and World War II kind of meant that a lot of that stuff got diverted or kind of put on hold as there were various regime changes going on around the world. But yeah, his work is the basis for all of this gender ideology stuff we're dealing with now. So he was born in Poland in 1868. He got his medical degree in 1892. He traveled around for a bit after that, went to the World's Fair in Chicago. And when he was there, he got into the gay like underground scene in Chicago. And he thought it was really interesting that it was very similar to the underground gay club scene that was going on in Berlin that he had already been a part of. And so he got this idea that he could normalize homosexuality, make it very accepted, make it very normalized and very mainstream if he could prove that, hey, this happens in all the different cultures, all the different countries around the world. So this is where it's tough with him, because his motto for his institute was justice through science. So that should already tell you a lot of what he was doing was actually political and not very scientific at all. Most of his work was based on surveys. None of the surveys survived the destruction of his institute by the Mean Mr. Mustache clan, supposedly. So we don't even know. We just have like a narrative that he distributed these surveys to 6,600 people in the universities around Germany, and that through these surveys, he determined that
it's always 66 or 666.
Yes, it's
always.
Of course, it's 600 surveys. And, you know, he determined that, 1.5% of people were gay and maybe 4.2% of people were bisexual, and that most people he is the founder of the idea that gender and sexuality are on a spectrum, that no one is fully heterosexual. We all are a little gay, right? He's the founder of that idea.
And when was he putting forth these ideas? Because Freud talks a lot about how, bisexuality, and that, he talks about it at a younger age, and how, kids don't really have a differentiation, that, that's part of your adolescence is discovering this. So
yes,
Freud does talk a lot about that.
He had some correspondence with Freud, so he set up a multiple different institutes and committees. This is what they all do. They've got this institute, that committee, this society for whatever, they all set up these organizations through which they can do all this social justice advocacy,
and of course the philanthropic, aspect, so that you can feel good about funding these things.
Yes, it's all just charity, you see.
Yeah.
The first one he set up was the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897.
Okay.
Which he founded with 3 other prominent German Jewish psychologists of the time. And he was, because they were all in Germany, right where Freud and Jung and a lot of these guys were in the German Empire at the time, they all had a lot of correspondence.
Right.
So this was 1897 when he started. And there was a German law called Paragraph 175, which made homosexuality illegal. It wasn't very strictly enforced. It was more like if the cops caught you doing obscene, lewd things in public, they had a way to prosecute that. But it was very weakly enforced because Berlin had this huge underground gay scene with 40 nightclubs.
Right.
Yes, there was a law, but it was not really enforced. So, but he started right off the bat with political activism to try to get this part of the law overturned. And like I said, his motto was justice through science, which sounds exactly like what we have today, right? It's always justice through, it's always, I have a study, or the studies say this and the scientists say that. So therefore you have to go along with the gender ideology, or you have to go along with the born this way theory. It's always based on science. Like, you have to base your social justice on science because it's fact.
And the justice aspect is, that it's just a rebranding of like League of Just, right? League of Just Men, which was Karl Marx and Engels.
Yes, exactly. So that's what he was doing, and he was very Marxist leaning, very left wing, of course. And
an interesting note about that, I don't know if you know, but for the audience, the League of the Just was an offshoot of the League of the Outlaws, which was an offshoot of the Illuminati. When the Illuminati supposedly went underground, they had all these little offshoots that were rebranded under different names, and it was the League of the Outlaws, which then became the League of the Just, which then became the Communist League, which Engels was the helm of.
And I have right here at this point in my notes that Hirschfeld was good friends with August Bebel, which, if you guys don't know who August Bebel was, he was like a very ardent Marxist in Germany who had a ton of influence on the Bolsheviks and the whole communist uprising. So he was good pals with him.
Yes.
And he was the originator. Okay. Magnus Hirschfeld was the originator of the "you have to accept them or else they will unalive themselves" narrative that we hear so much today. I mean, my husband debates this stuff all the time. And it is like a chorus of trans people going, "You have to accept us," and if you don't, we're going to unalive ourselves. You have to give us gender affirming surgery. You have to pay for it through the state. You have to affirm my pronouns. If you don't do these things, I will unalive myself and it will be your fault. And this was based supposedly on Hirschfeld's practice with his patients. He has a story that one of his patients committed suicide and left him a suicide note saying, "I hope that you will, change the world so that people like me can finally feel accepted and not have to unalive ourselves," right? Which, again, we don't have a lot of evidence that happened. We're just going with the story that that's what happened. And he said that through his surveys, he found that there was a higher incidence of unaliving yourself tendencies among homosexual people. And of course, still to this day, we always hear the narrative that this is because they're not accepted. It's because they're not accepted. It's because they're not accepted. Well, there's a lot of comorbidities and confounding factors that you find in people who have gender dysphoria, homosexual identity, that would explain, this tendency. They tend to have higher incidences of risky behavior, of partying a lot, of substance abuse, of childhood trauma, of depression, all these things, right? But right from the very beginning of the science on human sexuality and gender, we immediately get this narrative that, oh, well, if they're unaliving themselves, it has to be because they're not accepted.
Right. And meanwhile,
we don't have any science that proves that.
No.
It's just an assumption that's made, and then it's just asserted over and over and over again. So
for anybody who questions how unscientific it is, all you need to do is look at DSM-1 and look at DSM-5. The DSM-1 talks about it in the category of identity disorders. And so, of course, that would be the confounding comorbidities that you reference, because if somebody has an identity disorder, they are literally, a lot of times it stems from trauma. And
Mhm.
as we see when we look into things like MK Ultra, and certainly we'll get into it with the shell shock therapy research,
Yes.
and the trauma based mind control that was then weaponized as a result of that research. But when someone experiences trauma, that is a way, that's a coping mechanism. It's how the brain
Yes.
handles and deals with the trauma that was induced. And so you split from your identity. You have a hard time identifying and integrating with your core self. And
Mhm.
that, of course, would leave somebody with all sorts of mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression. Um, but it was in that category. And now instead of looking at the context of the person, the experience, perhaps their nature, nurture, circumstances that may lead them to have these issues, instead they blame it on the external society, and now
Yes.
it becomes an external problem, and everybody else needs to take care of the problem instead of dealing with the individual and helping them to heal
Right.
themselves.
Yes, exactly. I'm so glad that you said that because you put it really concisely and really well in a way that I probably wouldn't be able to do. But yes, that's exactly correct. So, right from the beginning, it was not a focus on really the individual and their own contextual issues, what might be causing them trouble. It was this immediate idea that, well, we have to rearrange all of society to accommodate whatever is going on. And that's how we fix the problem. And so the thing about Magnus Hirschfeld, he's gay himself. He had a longtime partner who was significantly younger than him, like 20 something years younger than him. He was very active in the club scene and those sort of things. And when he began his first institute, let's see, what I think that was 1919. He got this gigantic mansion. And this is supposedly all through a foundation, right? He set up a foundation to fund the Institute for Sexual Research, for Sexual Sciences, the Institute for Sexual Sciences. And it just, all that people say, no matter where you look in the historic records, it says we don't really know where the funding came from. We just assume it was personal donations. Even his current foundation, who holds all of the papers we do have of his, which isn't much, there's only like 35 surviving records or something like that. They just say that they assume that there were personal donations made to this foundation, which funded all of this. But the guy had a huge mansion for this institute, and it included a clinical setting, laboratory, a speaking hall. It had like a dormitory, and he had tons of gender confused and homosexual people living there who tended to be on the fringes of society, probably would have been prostituting or homeless. And it was kind of like a halfway house where he would give them employment as maids or servants or like secretaries. It was like he was inventing reasons to give them financial support and let them stay there in this house with him, this giant mansion. And this is what is so crazy to me when you read about Hirschfeld. Every source that you find will hail him as a hero, a stunning and brave hero who paved the way and wanted to make the world a more survivable place for people who were on the fringes of sexual identity, who had had such a horrific existence. And in my mind, it's sounding exactly to me like all of my work on feminism, where it's always portrayed that, oh my gosh, women were enslaved and their life was just unbearable and they could barely stand to be alive, and it was just so horrible. And so the feminists came and they liberated everyone, and they were stunning and brave and they were heroes. It's the same thing here, where you're only told that this man was a hero. He's worshipped. I'll just say it. He's worshipped, and every record keeping, it's the same thing as with feminism. It's all in certain universities where it's an explicitly LGBT rights department within a university that has all the records, that has all of the history. So they are gatekeepers of the history, and they only tell you how wonderful and benevolent and kind and great this man was. But I found some things that I think you guys might agree with me are pretty sus. So for example, Hirschfeld has these people he's working with. He has colleagues that come here and work with these people. So So first you've got a halfway house of people that no one is going to miss, that no one is keeping track of, that if anything were to happen to them, you're probably not going to have cops particularly interested in investigating like what happened to them. If you were to abuse them, who are they going to go to for help? So he's got this population of extremely vulnerable people who now depend on him for shelter and for food and for their very existence. And he's basically used them as psychological experiments. So he would do this psychotherapy counseling with them. And through the course of that, he and his friends decided to experiment in the first gender transition surgeries. And this is where, like yesterday, I was texting Courtney going, I need a sedative.
Wow.
I need like sleeping pills and booze because this is disturbing to me. So
Yeah.
the first couple of transition surgeries, like it was horrible to read what happened to these people. One of the first ones he was a Danish man named Einar Wegener. I'm terrible at pronouncing European names. Sorry. Probably Einar Wegener or something. And he was an artist who was married to a lady who was also an artist. I had a full ride art scholarship. Art students are weird and tend to be depressed, just so you guys know. Like I didn't fit in at all because I'm a really happy person. But they were two artists, and the girl, the wife of Einar, would do these portraits of women. She was kind of like lesbian curious. And she drew and painted all these women. And one day, one of her models, she would do like fashion magazine work at the time. And this is in the 20s and 30s. One of her models didn't show up one day, and she encouraged her husband to put on pantyhose and high-heeled shoes and model them so she could finish the piece that she was working on. And he hesitated, but he doing it. And this is from his autobiography that I read. Wow. This is what he said and how he described how this went. He said he never had any thoughts of being a woman, never had any gender confusion, always felt like a man. And he even described himself as a strong, sturdy man. Okay. And that something happened when he started dressing in women's clothes for his wife's artwork, where he felt that an entity entered him.
I've read this. Yeah. It's so creepy.
It's very creepy. He thought a female entity named Lily, which immediately I'm thinking Lilith.
Right. I had the same thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So this entity named Lily, who he described as a much younger than him female, a girlish female spirit, became like invaded his body and slowly began to take him over and slowly started insisting to him that he had to unalive himself as a man to make room for her within him. So he didn't describe, so this is a man who believed he was the first transgender ever. In his autobiography, he said he believed this had never happened to anyone else. He didn't have language by other psychologists fed to him as to how to explain this. So he's explaining it to everyone in his book using his own words. And he said, I slowly over time felt her taking over, and I knew that if I didn't give her what she wanted, like I was just going to die and that would be it. That the only way I had to get rid of myself to let her live. So he really starts going crazy. There's a film based on this guy called The Danish Girl. And again, the film is a total piece of propaganda where they make you super sympathetic to him, to the doctors who did these surgeries. And it's like this tragic story of how society wouldn't accept this man. And this is all he went through. That's not how I read it at all. When I read his autobiography, I'm like, this guy's possessed by a demon.
Yeah.
And he was desperate. His wife, meanwhile, becomes very famous and very wealthy in Paris as a painter. And she does all of the women's fashion magazines at the time, which in Paris was huge in the 20s and 30s. And she is enjoying the underground lesbian party scene, just partying all the time, probably lots of drugs and things like that involved, even according to like the film and stuff. And meanwhile, her husband is going deeper and deeper into this madness and this craziness, thinking that this female entity inside of him is taking him over and literally killing him. He describes it as, I felt myself weakening. I felt myself unable to fight her anymore. And it just became clear to me that I would have to find a way to like let her fully take over. And I didn't have an option about it. So he becomes really desperate. Every doctor he goes to says, yeah, you're like mentally ill. You're gay. Like there's something wrong with you, but you know, you're not a lady, sir. You know, and he didn't even describe it as that. He described it as, I'm me, a man, and there's a female entity within me trying to take me over. So the wife finds Hirschfeld and Hirschfeld's associates, and they consult with them. And they meet two doctors, Ludwig Levy-Lentz and Erwin Gorbrandt, and then also another surgeon, Kurt Warnekros. So these are three surgeons who are experimenting. They want to experiment with gender transition surgeries. They find this man who is suicidal and desperate. And this is what these insane doctors told this guy, as told by him in his autobiography. He says he has this meeting with the doctor and that the doctor tells him, I think you have female sex organs inside of you that never got a chance to develop properly. And I think you have both. And what I can do for you is give you strong functioning ovaries. And this man says, Lily, the entity inside me, wants me to not create by painting anymore. She wants me to create using my own blood. The word blood, like he said, blood, my own blood, and make a baby. So and the freaking insane surgeon, you guys, this is 1933 or something. Yeah, 1935, I think, was when they did this one. Tells him, yeah, we can do that. We can give you a womb and put an ovary in you. And I'm thinking, this is okay. So there's all these movies going, oh, what a wonderful benevolent surgeon, isn't he great? He's trying so hard to help. And I'm going, okay, I'm not a doctor, right. But even I know, where are you putting the womb? What are you connecting it to? Where is this ovary going? You understand that ovaries are controlled by your brain and that there has to be nerves and the whole endocrine system is involved. And this is extremely complicated. You can't just like shove an ovary and a uterus into a guy and get him pregnant. And obviously they would know that, right?
Right, of course.
Honestly, they would. And they're telling this man that they can give him a vagina and that he can get
that's exactly what they're doing now, right? Yeah. Men can get pregnant and they have periods.
Surgeons don't tell you that. So like the transgender surgeries we have right now with the neo-vagina stuff, they don't tell these people that you can get pregnant via a neo-vagina. They don't even tell him that now, but this doctor then told this man that.
But the magazines are, right? We have pictures of emojis with the pregnant men, and we have magazine covers with men who are supposedly pregnant. And so they're literally brainwashing people to think that that's reality. So yes, maybe some doctors still have some integrity, and when these people go for surgery, they're not being told that, literally you can get pregnant. But the culture is telling them otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. But this man, by this point, he was and this doctor told him, oh, it's because you had x-rays when you were young. There was x-rays done on you for some other problem like that he had when he was younger. And we think it basically killed the ovaries that you would have grown or had within you. And this guy believed it. He believed it. He went through with these surgeries. And of course, the surgeries were horribly botched. The man ended up suffering over the course of a year and a half and dying horribly from this insane surgery. And this guy at the time, you guys, 48 years old. What the hell are you doing implanting a uterus and an ovary from like a cadaver donor or something into a 48-year-old man, telling him he can get pregnant?
Crazy.
It's totally insane. And I'm like, yet the only popular portrayals of this story are like, oh, it's a harrowing story of a brave doctor who is trying to help a brave man. And they just portray it as so sappy and heartwarming and like, oh, if only society had accepted him, he wouldn't have needed to go to these lengths. And this doctor was just trying to do whatever he could to save the man. And I'm looking at it going, no, they're clearly exploiting a very vulnerable and probably demon possessed or at least mentally ill man and doing experimental surgeries on him, because if he dies, nobody will care. And nobody did care. Nothing happened. Their licenses weren't taken away. None of that kind of thing went on. There was no investigation as to what the hell was going on here. It was like, oh, he died. We tried our best. I guess that whole womb and ovary thing that we just shoved somewhere into his abdominal cavity, like, didn't work out. And it just,
Unbelievable.
it blows my mind. And they made a whole film about it in 2016 and portrayed it as this sweet, harrowing, heartwarming tale. And I'm looking at this going, no, this is like extreme exploitation. And this was not the last guy. They did this on another patient called Dora Richter that we don't know what happened to that person. And there was another, at least one other patient they were doing these experimental surgeries on that we don't even know who it is. And this is the point where I start to question the narrative of, oh, we don't have any records of who funded this or who was responsible or how we did this or how we got these organs or like what the procedure was. We don't have any information because the Nazis burned it all in the war. It's like, maybe that could be, but also I kind of have some doubts about that. I really do, because it's like, if I were these doctors doing these insane experiments on people, I wouldn't want anyone to know. And then this other thing I found.
Well, and also because who are they protecting, right? Like, who commissioned them? Who's paying for this? What organizations are behind this? Who was reporting it? Who kept silenced it, right? Like,
yes,
I think that they're probably covering for.
That's what I thought. That's the thing I got from
and where
it.
did we get things from, right? Because all of this takes money and resources. So
yes, exactly. And they've got this inexplicable giant mansion where they can house like dozens of people who can't support themselves and all this other stuff. And they're just like, oh, it was a foundation and people probably made private donations. It's like, yeah, I bet they did.
Those people, right?
Yes. Yes. Oh, we don't know. The records just poof, they're gone and we don't know. But I did find that one of these doctors who was doing these early sex reassignment surgeries on these poor souls, he ended up working in the Dachau concentration camp experimenting on prisoners there. And his main thing he was doing there, he did sex reassignment surgery experimentation on people, and he also did experiments on how you die from hypothermia. So they would intentionally kill prisoners via slow hypothermia, and he would like monitor the whole process of like how exactly it killed them. So this is the guy who was the benevolent, brave, courageous guy. He just wanted to help the people who were struggling with their gender identity. So he did these wacky surgeries on them. I'm just like, and no one questions this. Nobody in the LGBT historical record keeping community at all of these universities around the world looks at this and thinks what I'm thinking. They all just go, oh, stunning and brave. And I'm just like, no, it's not. Another colleague that worked with Hirschfeld on these projects was a psychologist who was American-based, and his name was Harry Benjamin. He worked with August Forel, who I mentioned in the last one, who was in like Freudian circles, and he worked with Alfred Kinsey, who we're going to get to in a little bit. But yeah, these people, what they were up to, and it was very explicitly politically motivated. I mean, Hirschfeld was constantly lobbying for overturning of any laws on this sort of thing. He wanted, like, they even foresaw things like having the government cover these kinds of transitions, medications, whatever it was that they were going to do with the transgender population. Like, this was 100 years ago. And they were already thinking in terms of, how can we make the state pay for it? How can we force the legislation to not only permit, but endorse these things that we are doing? And he started several other associations. He, with Freud's friend Carl Abraham, founded the Berliner Society of Psychoanalysis in 1910. Carl Abraham was also the president of the International Psychological Analytical Association. And so this was all in the same circles as Freud, but it's just that these were the guys actually doing experimental surgeries on extremely vulnerable people who I think they were exploiting. So that's just like, it's such a dark thing and you never hear about it. Oh, and the digital archive that has all this info on this Lily Elby, the first transgender surgery guy I was just telling you about, who died from this horribly botched, insane series of surgeries.
Yeah.
Guess who keeps the records?
Who?
The Lily Elby Digital Archive, sponsored by the Loyola University of Chicago, which is a Jesuit university, which has extensive ties to MK Ultra.
Of course.
I have like whole pieces on my Substack about that organization and them covering for gay. That's where they sent all the gay priests over the last 70 years. Anytime there was a scandal in the Boston Archdiocese or other places, they would send them to Loyola in Chicago to hide them there. And they are the ones that hold the digital archive with all these records. You can't get access to it unless you request it. It's very suspicious to me.
Very. Yeah, and laid the groundwork for everything that we're seeing now.
Yeah. Yep. And this organization that Hirschfeld had, they had newspapers, they had put out pamphlets. They had a long pattern of trying to manipulate public opinion on this. Not only this, but on World War I. They also did a lot of like wartime propaganda. Like in 1916, Hirschfeld had a paper out called Psychology of War. He put out a pamphlet on women's suffrage with his sister. In 1921, he started the first Congress for Sexual Reform, which became the World League for Sexual Reform. And these were like a series of really influential congresses held in big cities like London, Vienna, I think Berlin, in 1928, 29, 30, and 32. And Hirschfeld's the one who developed this system of 64 types of sexuality, where these are all supposedly on a spectrum. And this is still used.
Oh yeah, in California, I think it's up to like 81 now.
Yeah.
And it's a gender fluidity, and you're on a spectrum, and there is no male, female. That we're all a hybrid of all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this is remember the last episode we talked a lot about how Darwinism influenced these ideas. This is another case of that, where Hirschfeld asserted that this was nature's defense against overpopulation. Which they love. The Darwinists and the Malthusians, they love to talk about their overpopulation. So he would use that as propaganda for getting people to accept every kind of alternative lifestyle, which is something they're doing right now again. All the alternative lifestyles, no matter how creepy, no matter how deviant, no matter how degenerate it might be, it's actually a good thing because it prevents overpopulation. So he also created a movie in 1919. He co-wrote and acted in a film called German pronunciations, Anders als die Anden, Different from Others is the English translation. And it was a story of a gay man who was blackmailed by a prostitute that he was going to tell everyone that this guy was gay. He was like a politician. That was another propaganda piece, was you have to make homosexuality acceptable and normalized because people can be blackmailed. People can be blackmailed if they're gay. Like we have gay politicians, we have gay people in positions of power, and they get blackmailed because you guys don't accept homosexual lifestyles, and so they can be blackmailed with that. And this was his assertion as to why we needed to normalize all this stuff. And
the irony of that, because they use the blackmail. That's part of why the pedophilia rings are.
That's what they do.
Yeah, exactly. But they also use it as leverage. That's part of how the whole system works.
Yes, exactly.
So but of course, this is like a Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, right? You point the finger at the enemy doing exactly what you were doing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Another thing that he had going on at his Institute for Sexual Sciences, he had feminists who were abortion activists at the time. Margaret Sanger visited, a couple of other prominent suffragettes and like people who were into lesbian rights and abortion rights all came and like campaigned politically with him. So I think he did about this much science and about this much political activism and social conditioning is really what it was. And then it was this experimental surgery stuff, which is just so awful. So everybody thinks that Kinsey is the one that started this stuff, but this is, you know, a good decade plus before Kinsey, and Kinsey's ideas came from Hirschfeld. So Hirschfeld was a big influence on him. Now, Kinsey was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I found some other connections that we'll get into when we get further along that lead me to believe, because the Rockefeller Foundation was already involved in Germany in psychology. They were already involved around the time of World War I in wartime propaganda, psychological operations. I find it a little hard to believe they wouldn't have known about Hirschfeld. And he would be exactly the kind of person they would want to fund. But again, we don't have any records. The last thing I have to say about Hirschfeld is that after he did get kicked out by the mean Mr. Mustache clan and had to leave Germany, he went touring around the world, and he went to China. And while he was in China lecturing, he got a new boyfriend who was like 20 years old, and Hirschfeld's like 67 at the time.
Wow.
So we're talking about like a 47-year age gap. I know what I think of when I hear about a 67-year-old man with power and money and influence getting a 20-year-old boyfriend. And then he moved the new Chinese boyfriend back to Paris with the third boyfriend, the first one that he'd had for a while, who was 20 years younger. And he said, we're going to have a menage a trois and we're going to all live together. And the two didn't like it, but they were dependent on him for like money and financial support. And he paid them as secretaries and things like that. So they kind of just went along with it because they had to. And then after Hirschfeld died, the first boyfriend killed himself.
Oh.
And the younger one went to Canada and kind of did nothing with the rest of his life. So it's just like a really
I have to wonder what happened to Hirschfeld in his childhood.
I don't know, and I couldn't find anything on it. It's just that he was like one of the younger in a large Jewish family in Poland in the 1860s.
The trauma that he must have experienced for him to, you know, then conduct this in later life is, yeah,
this is not stuff that I think of when I think of brave, courageous, helpful, like empathetic people who just want to help society. He clearly had a personal agenda, and even now a lot of his work is criticized by people who say it's pretty clear that he had a very personal agenda and personal reasons for doing all of this. And I do think there's another aspect, because you ask yourself, like, why would they want to be doing these weird transitional surgeries that were so risky and so crazy? Well, if you're endorsing every kind of sexual degeneracy that you can imagine, right? If that's what you're into, and you've got a house filled with these people, you are naturally going to draw the money and attention of people who are into the weirdest things, right?
Sure.
And there are people who have fetishes for transitioned people. And so I do think that a lot of these people were kind of intended to be playthings, play toys, experiments for these, because it was a lot of wealthy and powerful people that were around Hirschfeld. I mean, he was friends with people in the Kaiser's government. He was friends with all the Freudian circles that had a lot of richer, more powerful people in it. He testified in some really high-profile political trials. And things like that. So he was well known. He had a lot of money. And I feel like the creepiest, darkest people would be very interested in like making some kind of sexual chimera or something like that. So I don't think this was just humanitarian scientists trying to help. That's not
Oh,
who
no,
I
no,
am.
no.
That's not what I get from it.
When I asked about his childhood, I wasn't it wasn't to be, sympathetic, but I do
No,
think
I know. Like you were
but I think
saying,
that's what happens. They take advantage of people who have experienced these types of horrific traumas. In some case, they were induced,
yeah.
as we know from our MK Ultra research. But I think that they know that those people are vulnerable, and
Yeah.
that's they get leverage that way.
Well,
Unfortunately,
that could have been another reason for doing this to these people, was to see how far you can push people.
yeah,
Let's see what happens when we do this to people. Let's see what happens, because according to everything I read, Hirschfeld did like a pretty long series of therapeutic sessions with this person before suggesting the gender transition surgeries. So they were like, I feel like they were thoroughly vetting him. Now, if you're somebody who thinks these are good people, you could say, well, they were just being careful and doing their due diligence. But from my reading of the story, I'm thinking he could have very well been seeing like, how dissociated is this person? Oh, you say
right,
you have an entity living inside your body.
yeah,
Let's see what happens. Maybe they were seeing, well, let's see what happens if we do what the demon in him wants us to do.
right,
Let's
right,
see what happens. Who knows? Like, this part is all speculation. I'm not accusing anyone of crimes. This is my legal disclaimer.
right,
Not accusing anyone of a crime. I'm not saying I have evidence that crimes were committed. I'm just saying that when I read these stories, this is what I think based on all the other stuff that I've studied and researched and read about. That this is not a benevolent humanitarian effort to save really troubled people. I think it was more of a similar to, I mean, you had a doctor involved who was doing human experimentation in death camps, who was killing people with hypothermia, just see what happened. And now I'm supposed to believe that he just really wanted to help the transgender guy. Like, I don't believe you. Sorry.
yeah. No,
So,
probably not. Probably
you
not.
know,
And
so
even
that's,
if you wanted to help, I just don't understand this whole notion around like you're going to it's a temporary problem and you're going to solve it with a permanent solution that
yeah.
may not fix the problem. Most likely and most evidence indicates it will not fix the
They
problem.
had
Even
to
at that time
know.
they know that. Yeah,
Yeah,
they have to
they
know
had
that.
to know that the chances of this person surviving these surgeries was extremely low.
Yeah.
They had to know that. But the guy in his own autobiography was like, well, I felt like I was going to die anyway, and it was my only hope.
Right.
So, of course, that's who you would pick. And, his wife was fine with it. Nobody else around, everybody in his family had disowned him and stuff. So I just feel like it's a very convenient thing to take these most vulnerable, marginalized people that
Yeah.
don't have anyone who's going to come after you and sue you or prosecute you or anything for blatant malpractice and abuse if you do these things to them. So we don't know for sure where the funding comes from. I'm going to continue to pursue this, though. I'm like a dog at
Yeah. Well,
this point. I
it,
couldn't do it in the course of a week or two, but I think
yeah.
I think there might be some things, because I've already found some other connections that make me think. I kind of feel like I know where to look, so I'm going to keep looking.
Right.
But that's mainly what I have on Hirschfeld, and then everything else I have probably ties in with what you have on Tavistock. You want to talk
Sure.
about
Well,
that?
I can sure. And Tavistock is a monster, so I'll give you kind of like
Yeah.
the overview because we literally could spend like and maybe we will, but we could do like a series just on
Yeah.
Tavistock and it could be, each episode could be several hours long. So this is more of like an overview so people can have a sense of what it is. I'm going to start by saying I played the commercial for the event that I'm doing June 3rd and 4th. And this is Tavistock is a perfect reason why we are doing this event because Tavistock is like I think of it as kind of like a shadow worldwide government that think tank that
Yeah.
is works mostly under the guise of warfare military research, but what we see is they're really a social engineering steering committee, um, and they do a lot of culture creation. That's kind of really what they do, and a lot of the social science research was in my opinion, done, and I think the evidence indicates pretty strongly in this direction that the research that was done was to gauge how best to manipulate opinion. and how to socially engineer the masses. And so the event that we're doing is called Rebels for a Cause. Cause stands for Creative Artists Uniting for the Sovereignty of Everyone. So the mission behind this is that I always say that I think their agenda is to create a transhuman, which Rachel just laid out, kind of like the early stages of this, but they want a transhuman leading to post-human world that's controlled by an AI cyborg mind that they program. And I think the best antidote to that is for us to be radically human. And one of the things about human beings is that we are creative beings, and that we have one of the things we create is art. And unfortunately, the enemy knows this so well, and they have co-opted art for the purposes of socially engineering the masses, for purposes of conditioning, programming, and really for mind control in many cases. So I think that we need to unite in person, because they want us atomized in little silos in the metaverse. And they want us not to interact with each other. And there's something just, well, it's great that we have the technology and we can do things like this on the internet. It does not replace in-person human interaction. There's something incredibly powerful about that. And there's something incredibly powerful about art that has the power to effectuate change on a cellular level. And it's fun. So the parent company's name is actually fun. It's the Freedom Unity Network. So yeah. So anyway, I want you all to know about that. The link for it is below, and you can just go to rebelsforcause.com, take out the A, and it's 4 spelled out. So rebelsforcause.com, and you can find out more information about that. And I hope you can come. We have some really great.
I think we're doing it.
Yay!
So, Mindy and I have been trying to plan this because we have Montanica like right after, but I figured out that the plane tickets from Nashville to Montana are way cheaper than Michigan. And Andy really wants to go to yours. Like, it's right up his alley with a lot of the stuff he does. So he's like, yeah, I really would like to go to that. So I think we're going to drive down there, fly to Montana from there, fly back, and then drive back home. It's going to be a wild week and a half, but that's the plan. So if you guys would like to come and see me and Courtney, and you want to meet Andrew, and Jay and Jamie are going to be there, like the whole gang's going to be there. So if you can make it to Nashville, it's going to be a wild time. And it's a 2-day event, right?
It is a 2-day event. Yeah. The VIP is actually 3 days. We'll have an event on Friday night for the VIPs. So
awesome.
Yeah. So it should be awesome. We have some really great music acts. We have some comedy. We have a lot of wonderful speakers, and we're in talks with some possibly like one big headliner. We're still in talks, but yeah, so it should be really fun. I'm excited.
Awesome.
Cool. So anyway, that's part of why I think Tavistock is really important for people to know. I do think up until 2 years ago, I had no idea what Tavistock was. I think most people didn't, and it's very apropos that you bring up Hirschfield, because that's kind of what brought Tavistock to the forefront of people's minds, is that they got sued for the transgender surgeries on the kids. So prior to that, most people had never heard of Tavistock, and that's exactly how they wanted it. And from its inception, and it started really before World War II, and it was to create propaganda. It was to create, manipulate people's opinions around engaging in World War I. Contrary to popular opinion, it was not popular. People did not want to engage in World War I. And there was a lot of propaganda required to do so. And it started, roughly so in 1909, we had the British Secret Service became the MI6. So they rebranded, kind of similar to the way our OSS became the CIA, which Tavistock was actually very largely involved in that as well. And we'll get to that much later. But Kurt Lewin, who was kind of the forerunner of the OSS, which then became the CIA, and Kurt Lewin was one of the, he was one of the forerunners of the, the psychological systemization, like the systems that were created under Tavistock. And he was one of the premier psychologists involved in that. It was around right before World War II. 1912 was when the Wellington House was starting to form, and it was known as the British Propaganda Bureau. And they literally called it that. And their justification was that Germany had this propaganda bureau, and there was so much propaganda that was being spewed out of Germany, and they needed something to combat all of that. And this is what we see. We see this all the time, and we see this now, where it's in the name of defense that they can create these entities that they get basically like black ops carte blanche budgets for. I always use the example of DARPA because most people are familiar with ARPA, right? The Advanced Project Research Agency. And, not that I would say that I like support everything that they were doing or that there was nothing shady going on there, but it was much more transparent. And then, of course, they created DARPA because they put the D in front of it so that they could now do things in secrecy. And that was really the purpose of it. And I feel like that's a really great example. It's just the ARPA to DARPA. And that's what they do pretty much with everything. So it was 1912, and it was the National Insurance Commission, but it was more popularly known as the British Propaganda Bureau, or the Wellington House, because they didn't think people would respond so favorably to knowing the things that were being done out of the National Insurance Commission. But it's worth noting that it was the National Insurance Commission because most of the model for Tavistock and for what they were doing was predicated on the British East Indian Company. And the British East Indian Company, for those who are not familiar, was kind of like, the drug cartel of the day. And right. And they had all these insurance, and their drugs were mostly, the opium industry, but it was also more benign things like coffees and teas and sugar. But it built this consumeristic material model of addiction, and that was what it was designed to do, amongst a lot of other things. And the imperialism of the British Empire, and then the Dutch company was modeled off of that. But Tavistock was modeled off of it in the sense that you see how they created basically this drug cartel, and then they created these ancillary insurance entities to protect the drug cartel. And what do we have that looks like that? We have something called Big Pharma, and then we have these life insurance companies and these health insurance companies and all of these big conglomerates, and they all work together. And you can see how now the health insurance companies are all in a race to raise their ESG scores. And so they're forcing all these compliances with the HR programs, which Tavistock oversees HUMRO, which was the human resource research organization that was created. So we'll get back to propaganda machine, which was it was Charles Masterman, who was commissioned by the royal family to essentially set up this British Propaganda Bureau. We'll get back to him, but just very briefly, he was basically in charge of creating and overseeing all of these different like newspaper outlets that would create the propaganda to get, because most people saw it as like a war with Britain and Germany. There was a schism with Britain and France, but it was mostly Britain and Germany, and nobody else really wanted to be involved. So what they realized, though, was they really needed the support of the United States. And that was largely, so while it was definitely to garner acquiescence from the British people, it was mostly to manipulate the opinions of the Americans. And that's why they were overseeing Wilson, and we'll get to that in a bit, but they were very involved in Wilson's presidency and, the Federal Reserve Act and all of these wonderful things that we got as a result of that. The one that I always love to point out, and this is just a really interesting because it was brought up pretty recently, and when I recently learned about this from Tavistock, I remembered this and started to have a whole kind of paradigm shift around politics for sure. But they weaponized the term isolationist because
I remember that.
Right. And it was out of Tavistock in around 1913 because George Washington warned he warned the United States about being involved in any foreign entanglements. And this is actually Washington talked about how, and this is not to say that there were no question marks around
Right. Right.
Washington. I feel like people get very like polarized and they're thinking people are
Yeah.
either good
Like,
or
is he
bad.
a
I'm like,
good guy or is he a
we're
bad
humans.
guy? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of times they're kind of all bad guys, and sometimes they say something true or good, but that doesn't mean that we like endorse them. Yeah.
Exactly. And not only that, but there's humans, right? Humans are pretty complex, and there's a lot of things that influence their behaviors, their actions, and their perceptions and their worldviews. And so it's usually much more nuanced than we want to believe.
Yep.
So all that to say that Washington did warn against the two-party system. He didn't want parties. And his biggest justification for not having parties was that it welcomes foreign entanglement, and it makes us susceptible and vulnerable to being manipulated by external interests. And I don't think he was prescient. I think he was very aware of what was happening, because this is speculation, but it is based on what I know of him. I know he was a Mason. He was very familiar with what happened with the infiltration of the Illuminati and with the schism between like the national Masons and the more globalized Masons, and just the different lodges around the
Yeah.
world who are having all of these ideological and philosophical arguments. And then there was the infiltration of the Illuminati, and he was very aware of all of that. And I think, having witnessed that and been on the inside of that, he was warning the American people as much as he could warn them,
Right.
based on what he knew. That's my conjecture, but I do know for a fact he did warn us against the parties, and he did warn us specifically because the parties would welcome foreign entanglement. And so a lot of American people really were not interested in being engaged in other people's wars.
Right.
And so they use the term isolationist like a dirty word, just like the CIA weaponized the term conspiracy theorist, in 1957. So, and
They
it's very
still do that
similar.
now. Do you guys remember when Ron Paul would
That was
run
what
for
I was going to bring
office
up. Yes.
and everybody would go, "He's a dirty isolationist. He's an
Yep.
isolationist." And I would be like, I don't think you even understand what that means. And just because we don't want to be part of, globo homo or be in constant world wars isn't the same as like this dirty idea of isolationism. It's not North Korea, right? Where we're just like closed off from the world. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's what
Well,
they made it sound like. It's similar to what they did with the term conspiracy theorist, where they just wanted to completely discredit a whole movement. And so they come up with a term and turn it into like a
they
dirty
wanted
word.
to, it was from the document 1035-960, which was countering the Warren Commission. They wanted to avert any investigation into JFK's assassination. And so the way they did that was they labeled you a conspiracy theorist. So it was a way of shutting down the conversation. And that's what they're rebranding. They're reviving it now, just to discredit anybody who has any kind of perspectives that are outside the mainstream narrative. But with Ron Paul, I think what they were doing was there were a lot of it was really how they were able to expand the neocon movement, because especially around foreign policy, because
Yeah.
a lot of the neocon movement was they were war hawks. It was a warmongering kind of, well, war is good for the economy. That's what they
Yeah.
were taught, right? And it was a way of expanding the military industrial complex, and it was very lucrative for them. But that was what I would always hear from people on the political right who, I would now in hindsight label neocons. They
Neocons.
would say to
Yeah.
me, well, Ron Paul is so great, but his foreign policy, he's just crazy. I mean, we just can't have that. He's Looney Tunes.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And before people in the chat get upset and think that we are like campaigning for Ron Paul or that we loved George Washington or something, no, we're just saying that there's sometimes that, again, people in history might say something that's true or correct.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that like it's the wrong way to think about stuff, that there's like good guys and bad guys. But that's another thing we've been conditioned to think, because we're going to go into this war propaganda, because psychology was immediately like the field of psychology. They went, we can use this for propaganda and public opinion and mind control, and we can socially engineer, and we can get public support for wars and other things we want to do via studying mass psychology, right? So
Exactly.
One of the things you guys have been conditioned to think is that there's good guys and bad guys, right? There's allies and Axis, and there's, like there was this big poll on Twitter recently. I'm forgetting who put it out initially, but they asked, did the good guys win World War II? And my response was like, I don't really think of it like good guys, bad guys, because and there was people who were yelling at me about that, and they were like, are you saying that we're not the good guys? And I'm like, well, Russia, you know how you all hate Russia and you all have Ukrainian flags in your bio? They were the good guys
Hey.
in World War II, and then immediately after became the bad guy. Like, you don't even know what the hell you're talking about. So just this binary idea that there's a good side and a bad side, and that there's good guys and bad guys. You'll get your patriotic Americans who think the founding fathers were just like the apostles, that they were sinless and blameless and perfect in every way.
They
And
were human.
yes, and it's like, no, that some of the things they did and some of the ideas they had might have been good, but a lot of them were Masons, a lot of them were up to shenanigans, and a lot of the things they did weren't good. So it's just not that simple to look at history as a binary and think that there's a good team and a bad team. So if we're talking about figures, just keep that in mind. That's all.
Yeah, I always say that if people spent as much time as they did, like glorifying and vilifying sources and entities and people as they did actually just looking at information,
Right.
blindly looking at information, because you can, I mean, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? We would be in a
Exactly.
very different place as humanity. So, yeah. Yeah, a broken clock is right twice a day, and even the most brilliant, most like expertised, source can be wrong. So
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah,
Totally.
just start looking at information. If you adjudicate information, you'll be much better off. So
Yes, exactly. So sorry to interrupt, but pick
no,
back
no,
up
no.
with
I appreciate that, because it is one of my pet peeves, because I feel like that's how the dialectic progresses. That's
yeah.
literally how the dialectic progresses, and it always progresses left. But what we'll see through Tavistock is very interesting, because they use the dialectic essentially. I've always thought that the powers that be tend to align ideologically with the left. So, a lot of that messaging is aligned with the left. That's the New World Order, which Tavistock oversaw. Wilson, and he was the first president to come out and publicly be in support of the New World Order. He wrote this book, The New Freedom, which was actually plagiarized mostly, and I'm totally blanking on who it was plagiarized off of. It was he attributed it to William Hale. Yeah. But they, so they align with the ideology of the left, but they actually advance their agenda through the right. And it's because they feed the talking points that people have been conditioned to want to hear, that patriots, whatever label you want to give, because they create all these different factions, and they spew those talking points. But meanwhile, they're advancing the agenda. And we'll see that a little bit later. I'll get to some of the think tanks that Tavistock actually created or co-opted, and many of them are right-wing, quote unquote, right-wing think tanks, like the Hudson Institute, the Hoover
Yep.
Institute, the Heritage Foundation. A lot of these that we think that people tend to think of as being conservative, either never started out that way at all. They were, under the auspices and guided by Tavistock and funded through similar entities, or they were co-opted in many cases. So there, it was Lord Northcliffe and Rothmere, who were kind of like the head overseeing under the crown to create this Wellington House. And then, of course, in the United States, it was Edward Bernays and William Lippmann,
Yep.
who were they were part of the essentially the language creation that created the public opinions for getting people to accept the entrance of World War I. So, let's see, where do we have?
And some of those people come back in on my other part here I have about the same type of institutions here in the US around World War II. Edward Bernays was part of it with some other people. So yeah, it's like a handful of people, and they're always all connected, and they're always in the same circles, and they're just completely steering the course of history. This is why we call it crypto history. It's not cryptocurrency. I don't know hardly anything about that. So I can't tell you about cryptocurrency, but we call it crypto history because it's like the hidden part of history that you don't learn in school, that isn't in the mainstream, but it's really the things that steer the course of history and have created the world that we live in now. And it's so incredibly important. And almost nobody knows about it unless you're in our little circles here on the internet or like certain people, right? But like the masses at large don't know anything about any of this. And sometimes I forget. Sometimes because all
I
my friends,
know. I do too. I'm like,
I
doesn't
really
everybody know
forget.
this?
Yeah, like somebody on Twitter the other day was like, well, I elect people and they go to Washington and then they do the government based on what I want because I elected them. And I'm like, I forgot that there's still a lot of people who really think that's
I
how it
saw you
works.
post that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like, sometimes I forget that most people think that we just elect people. They go to Washington, they sit in Congress, and they do a little debating and they write a few laws, and that's how the government works. And I'm just like, no, that's not even close. So
Not
it's
even close.
not even close. That's just like a front for all the other stuff that's going on. But that's why we're
Totally.
doing this. So, so
So
you
just
said
to
that this
lay
is
out some of
around
the
World War
main
One that they had this propaganda to get people involved in World War One.
say this again?
Did you say that this group of propagandists was trying to affect
Yeah,
public
so the
opinion?
Wellington House, it was in the Wellington House, it was the British Propaganda Bureau, and is literally created to garner acquiescence for World War One, and mostly to influence the United States. And so they oversaw Wilson. This was like the Federal Reserve Act was a huge part of this, and many historians agree that we could never have gone into World War One if that had not been instantiated. So that was part of it. Of course, then the income tax, they basically they called it like tariff adjustment, but it was essentially tariff destruction,
Yeah,
which was this is also based off the model of the East Indian British Company, but it was really, people think of it as how we were we created free trade markets, but that was again propaganda that was created by Tavistock to make us think free trade is a total lie. It is really just exporting. It's deindustrialization of the United States. They
yeah.
were very largely influenced later. Tavistock really used Spangler's work, and
Oh,
that's why they were so focused on the destruction of the Western civilization, of course, particularly the United States of America. But free trade was the propaganda to create deindustrialization and export our manufacturing, which they've been incredibly successful with now, but this started back then. So that was one of the things they were doing. They were very invested in the de-elevation of women. They wanted to destroy femininity. This is why a lot of the propaganda that Tavistock, and this was Tavistock that did it, that was the hypersexualization. You saw this in the 20s, right? That the famous song "A Glimpse of Stocking" was looked on as something shocking. Now
yeah,
heaven knows anything. I can't.
yeah.
But yeah, and this was Tavistock because it really was about destroying the family. And of course, it was, they were eugenics, Malthusian philosophies that were, they were rooted in. But it was also really just about creating a degenerate culture because they
Mhm.
wanted to demoralize the American people, the British people as well. But they knew the demoralization would lead to chaos, and that it would then be a breeding ground for usurpation of power and help corral them into what I love about Coleman's work in particular, because he wrote one of the only books, him and Estlin really cites Coleman mostly. He has a few other, sources, but he cites Coleman a lot because he was one of the first people to expose the Tavistock Institute. But what I love is people hear the term New World Order, but he spells it out. He says New World Order inside a socialist one world government. And he makes that very explicit that was
Wow.
their goal. And I love that because you never hear that second half of it.
Yeah.
And the New World Order sounds great. It's just new age. It's it's one love and it's all it's a
Progress
new
for
thing
humanity.
and it's hip and it's cool, but really it's new world order inside a socialist one world government, and that's really what they were trying to engineer. And I don't think that term or that philosophy really germinated from the 1912 1913 era, but certainly it was the first time that they were publicly announcing it, and especially in the United States, where they were making it very public that their goals were to create this one world socialist government, and the inside, a inside a socialist government, but a one world government. But one of the things that they talked about that they had to do in order to create this, the propaganda behind it. That's what Tavistock was all invested in. They were invested in shaping. They called it like polling. So this is where like social scientists come into play. They called polling. It was actually called public opinion making. So they knew that
Yep.
it wasn't about like just surveying the masses and figuring out where they stood and what they thought. This was
Yes.
really about shaping their opinion. This was what Bernays would call engineering consent. And
Yes. Hence why they had teams of psychologists doing this. These weren't just like random people taking a survey like when they do the census. These were psychologists steering these programs and figuring out how to manufacture consent,
yeah,
which I can think of multiple times just in my lifetime alone, where now in hindsight we can look back and see manufactured consent. September of 2001 and the things that happened after that would be an example, because and people always look back on that time and go, it was a time of great unity in the country. We were all unified. It was so wonderful to be unified. And I'm like, you always have to be a little bit suspicious when the entire country is unified behind something, because it usually means they've done something to create that, right?
yeah.
And then the events of the past few years are again complete and total engineered, manufactured consent.
Yeah, and this is what we're saying, that the part of why I think this is so important is because they did all of this laying the groundwork. We were just talking about this before we went live, but I think they laid this groundwork to test how do people respond, and to do all of this social research. They tested that for World War I, and then they refined it for World War II. And I really think the past 3 years have been laying the groundwork for what they would like. I'm not saying will happen. And I mean, you can argue that we're already in World War III, and in many ways we are. But whether in psychological information, some could argue a biological, but I think they really do want to get to a full kinetic kind of warfare. And that's really interesting too, that this is later on, well, after World War II, but just since it's relevant in terms of this. But one of the ways that they created these to destroy the to isolate nations was to take to create this fear around nuclear energy. And
Yes.
they actually had through women's magazines, which is often how they do this propaganda. But they
Mm-hmm.
did it like in McCall's, and it was I'm blanking on her name, but apparently she wrote this, and she was like married to a senator, and she wrote this article. It turns out she didn't write it at all. Like the Tavistock writers wrote it for her.
Of
And
course.
and of course
course.
it like stirred up the women. They were terrified. Oh my gosh, well, we can't have nuclear war. And so this is the propaganda that was used. So I don't know how far into the weeds we want to go, just because there's just so much.
Yeah.
But I can give you a little bit more of, obviously it then became the Tavistock Clinic in 1920 or 1921. And the name came from the Marquis of Tavistock, who was Ian John Russell. He's a descendant of William Russell, who was known as Raphael in the Illuminati. So yeah, who is a direct kind of descendant. So wait, am I getting that right? No, he was a direct descendant of, that's Wilhelm Wundt. I always confuse these two.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a direct descendant of the founder of William Russell. It was William Russell, but he was the creator of Skull and Bones. Yeah.
I didn't know that. How did I miss that? That's
Yes.
crazy.
So
Huge.
the early on in 1912, so when you through propaganda, we see this through the arts, right? This is again why I said that I think my event is so important, and we want to make this a tour and roll this out because we do want, there is actual art but done by genuine people, genuine creative artists who are pro freedom, pro sovereignty, and pro humanity, most importantly, right? But most of the propaganda is done through the arts. And Tavistock, we know the infamous Beatles, and how
Yes.
they, whether or not they created the Beatles or whether or not they co-opted them, they were
Right.
definitely involved, and we know that much. But they started off that way. It was the initial meeting for the Wellington House in 1912, had 25 authors, people like H.G. Wells, who was largely
He's everywhere.
everywhere.
He's
And
in every nefarious thing that happened while he was alive. He's just everywhere.
everywhere.
You can see
And
why Jay hates him so much. It's
what?
like Jay absolutely hates him. Jamie says it's like a swear word in their house to say H.G. Wells.
H.G. Wells, yeah.
Well, why? Because he's just
a monster.
everywhere. Yeah, and he was just in everything, and he was just this full-on globalist, transhumanist hater of humanity. So,
and wasn't he a disciple of like Kissinger? And yeah, so
yeah. Oh, I've got some stuff about all of that here.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just tell you some of the other names
Yeah.
Rudyard Kipling, who was a great disappointment to me, but of course, part of Tavistock's initial foundings was Cecil Rhodes and Milner. They were very involved, and all the Fabians and the Frankfurt School, they merged, they converged through Tavistock.
Mhm.
Tavistock oversees them, did a lot of crafting of the language that they used to help their messaging. So they were very influential in spreading, the messages behind them. And that's kind of, they're aligned anyway, but there really was a convergence through Tavistock. But Rudyard Kipling was a disappointment to me. Arnold Bennett, because If is like my favorite poem of all time. But yeah, William Archer, G.K. Chesterton. Yeah, there were 25 of them, but they knew that the literary works were going to be very instrumental in rolling out some of this propaganda. So, and then of course it was in 1948. I get different readings on this. Some people say that it was 1947 or 46, but 48 it was definitely became the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. The Tavistock Clinic in 1921 was he donated the building that was specifically designated for shell shock therapy research. The shell shock therapy research is, where they did these post-traumatic stress research on these soldiers, and they would induce traumas on the soldiers and test how they responded to the trauma. The other thing that Tavistock did, I think that's more well known to people. The other thing they did that was just like horrifying to me was they wanted to test how, like they did these bombings, and it was of civilians. Yes,
What?
Tavistock.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and it was to gauge, like the responses, but it was just like civilians in Germany.
Just bombed them just to see what people would do.
Yeah, and
Well,
how
let's see
I
what happens
think
when you
a
just
lot
drop
of
a
it was
bomb.
around like because a lot of what Tavistock was testing was crisis response.
Yes.
So
Yeah, and it's so crazy to me that you just said that, and that there will be people now who don't believe that things like that would happen. They wouldn't do, chemtrails. They wouldn't do, coof. They wouldn't do that. And it's like we have so many examples of them doing that and worse to people. And it's right there in the history, and just people either don't know it or they hear about it and they just won't process it. They just won't. I've had that happen to me where I've tried to talk to people about something, and I can give them proof right in front of their face, and they just hand wave it away because it's like, no, I don't like that version of reality. I like the one that I already have, that I understand. And if you tell me that and I accept it, I'm gonna have to like look into other things, and I want to do that, and it freaks me out, so they don't want to hear it. But
that.
When was this that they were doing that? This was World War One or just right after World War One that they were like
I
randomly bombing people to
No,
see what their response
I think
was?
it was before World War II.
Okay.
I have to look up the exact date of it, but yeah, I do think it was I think it was right before World War II. But
Okay.
let me get back to you on the date of that.
That I mean that makes sense based on some of the stuff I have that was going on at the time. Because
Yeah.
the ramp up to World War II, they were doing a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I want to say it was like 1937 or somewhere around there, but I'd have to confirm that. I don't know. But before I get to that, I just wanted to there's a couple. So the isolationist term, it was 1916 that they weaponized
Oh,
that, and it was in 1917 to 1919 they created the Krill Commission, which was
what?
it was like a committee on public information, and
Okay.
this was largely involved in influencing the public opinion to support the U.S. into World War One. So they had a whole bunch of. I mean, there were many like what's his name who was involved in. He was the founder of the Daily Mail. Uh, Masters Masterman. That's his name, Masterman. He like commissioned him. I'm trying to find what his name was, but they were like very well known, like you would know, like Waldorf Astor was
Yep.
one of the so like all of these really big kind of journalistic outlets, they
Yes.
were all commissioned
The
under
Hearst
Master.
magazines were
What?
involved. The
Yeah,
Hearst
the Hearst
magazines were
magazine.
involved at this time too.
And it was under Masterman, who was commissioned under the Crown. So the initial Wellington House really was the Crown, but then the Tavistock Clinic was the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. Certainly, the Crown was involved for the funding, and then of course the Tavistock Clinic, Tavistock Institute. Yeah, was the same players, but then it's much bigger. You know, it's a much bigger entity. But the Rockefellers, I just want to point this out too. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the Flexner Report of 1910, and the Flexner Report was where the Rockefellers they had the monopoly on the petrochemicals, on
Mhm.
petroleum, and so they wanted to create the petrochemical industry and roll it out into the pharmaceuticals. So they incentivized any schooling, and they stripped funding and board certification for anything that wasn't pharmaceutically related. So really, it had to be so a lot of but prior to that, there was a lot of natural medicine. There was a lot of like
Mhm.
herbal medicine, Eastern medicine incorporation. It was much more holistic. But then
Yeah.
the schooling and the training and all the board certifications, the funding for that got stripped, and you had to be trained and schooled in the petropharmaceuticals. And I just point that out to say that I don't think that it's a coincidence, because I think they were paving the way for the psychiatric industry,
Yes.
and which the psychological industry that they had now garnered so much credibility, quote unquote, now laid the foundation for people to trust the psychiatric industry. So I think
Yes.
that was. And then the other thing that the Tavistock Institute did that I just think is super relevant, and it was pretty early on that they were doing this, they had a 3-system response, and this was where they were testing the crisis reactions. And so the first response is superficiality. So you adopt like a superficial, shallow, like advertising slogan. I think we saw this over the past 3 years. That's why I think it's in the forefront of people's minds to understand how this 3-system response works. And this comes out of Tavistock. And this was they started this for World War One, in all this testing, because as Rachel was saying before, it's these social science researchers who do this. We need psychologists to understand how people's behavior responses play out in order to then be able to manipulate opinion of the masses. So this testing is so it's superficial, shallow advertising slogan, and they pass off as like ideals. And but what happens is people anchor to those slogans, and then the actual crisis is never identified. So it gets kind of just people pass along, right? Because they anchor to these slogans that have been,
Yeah.
and I won't use them just because I know we're on YouTube, but people can use their imagination over the past few years, and I'm sure they can come up with some. The
Yep.
second
Yep.
part of this is fragmentation, right? So this is all that panic that ensues, and the social unrest is used to break the society down. So this is part of
Yeah.
why they did those bombings, right? This is who did this and how did this happen, and people are filled with despair. There's chaos and they're demoralized, and then they start getting fragmented because people start to take sides and people start to create justifications, and they're aligned with this one, and now they're fighting against each other, and the media feeds into this. And
Yes.
this started with this wartime research. I put it in air quotes. And then they have the fantasy trip, which is the complete dissociation. So this is why I always say, I do, anybody who follows my channel knows I interview a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, but a fair amount of SRA survivors. And part of why I do this is because, obviously we should all care about the victims, and it's particularly the children, and whatever we can do to help them, I absolutely want to do. But I also want to really impress on people that it's not relegated to this small group of people. It is not, it's much more pervasive than people think, and it affects everyone. Thank you for that. I didn't want to say it out loud, but
I know we
yeah.
can't. We can't. So I just put it in the chat in case you guys don't know what that term is.
Cool. So it's but it is very pervasive, and it affects everyone because they beta test on individuals and then they weaponize against the masses.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing so much of that. And this is where, so we know that with like for instance MK Ultra, they really utilize, and a lot of this came out of Tavistock shell shock therapy research that they did. They utilize the coping mechanism of dissociation. It used to be called, talk about the shift in the DSM. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. It is now called dissociative personality disorder. And
Yes.
I can go into many reasons why they did that. And I think a lot of them are actually legal, but some of them are propaganda. It is to manipulate the perception, and they leverage the dissociation, which is a coping mechanism against trauma. And this is what they discovered, was that people who were traumatized by a mass crisis event, so some people might refer to like a false flag, like a
Mhm.
Reichstag fire, like a big 9 event,
Yep.
these kind of, or a big
It,
epidemic labeled as a pandemic kind of thing.
yes,
um
or when a president gets assassinated
right,
and
good.
everyone in the country remembers where they were and
Exactly.
all that sort of so
So they
yeah.
use that to test, because what they realized was that that was a great tool for ushering in, a color revolution, essentially, because people become dissociated from the trauma. So they test these things, individually, and then they did do mass scale testing of it as well. But those are the 3 phases of a crisis response that they've assessed, and I
Yeah.
think they've really refined it. So
Yeah. So I have some stuff on this too. So that's what was
okay.
kind of going on in England. And there's a lot of cross pollination between what was happening in Europe and what was happening in America, because all of the academics and the
Because
politicians
they were
and
intentionally infiltrating.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, they were all kind of on the same team and they were all part of the same stuff.
Mhm,
So the
mhm,
counterpart that we had here in America regarding the psychological warfare research part of psychology, which this was a much bigger part of psychology research than you guys would probably initially expect. They
mhm.
were quite busy with this. So it's very interesting that you can go to the Rockefeller archives and they actually talk about like psychological warfare research as though
Yeah,
it's like a good thing, right? Because it's the same thing they did with MK Ultra, it's the same thing they do with the Cold War. It's always, well, it might seem like dirty business, but we had to do it because the enemy was doing it, right? That
yep.
kind of a thing. So, a very interesting person that I found here in the United States who was Rockefeller funded as well, doing this psychological warfare research and actually applying it to the public, was a gentleman named Hadley Cantrill. He was a psychologist from
Oh,
Princeton. He
yeah.
actually got a PhD in philosophy of psychology in 1931 from Harvard, and then he joined the Princeton faculty in 1936. And he became the president of something called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis here in the United States out of Princeton. And he was associated with Edward Bernays, Century Foundation founder Ed Feline, who owned like a big department store chain and had a foundation for it basically became one of the big progressive think tanks of the time with all the social justice stuff and things like that. And then also Alfred Adler, who we had mentioned in a previous episode, who was in Freud's Vienna Circle and the Wednesday Society. So we talked about that last time. Those guys were all in this Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And Cantrill was like a central figure, and he was involved in a lot of this crazy stuff that was going on in the 30s. The 30s were like a fun, wild decade because they're like ramping things up to World War II. They know that World War I is still fresh enough in a lot of people's minds, and it was so horrific, and there was such loss of life, and it was a mass trauma event for the whole world, that people were war weary. The 30s were the Great Depression. The last thing anybody wanted was another giant international war. So, but they knew they wanted to do this because World War II was going to be the catalyst for the first like big reset where, the UN and the World Health Organization and the Bank for International Settlements and all of these giant global institutions that now shape the entire world were created out of World War II, and lots of borders were redrawn, and kingdoms were finally gotten rid of completely. I mean, World War I was a big part of getting rid of kingdoms and instituting nation states, and then World War II was like completing that process. So they wanted public support for the new World War. And Cantrill was like a central part of this. He was a member of something called the Radio Research Project, which was a Rockefeller Foundation project. Yeah. And you guys may know about the 1938 War of the Worlds address read by Orson Welles. It's H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Orson Welles got on the radio in 1938 and read part of it. And with no context, a large portion of the country thought that we were either under an attack from aliens or that the Germans had attacked us. And this was a massive experiment by the Radio Research Project, funded and created by the Rockefeller Foundation to see what would happen, because mass media was new. Radio was the first form of mass media, and they wanted to know, how can we affect the psychology of the public using mass media? So this was their first big, really a horrible trick to play on people. Like, there were people who really freaked out and thought this was like the end of the world. And they used this to study it. They did a whole study. You can go find the papers and read their research papers, their study papers on this event. And Cantrill found that he guessed that about 25% of people believed the broadcast was about an attack from Germany, not aliens. And he studied like the effects of people's psyche, like what happened to them when they heard this address, how people reacted, how it was reported in other parts of the media. It was basically just another giant horrific experiment that they did on the public to see how they could use radio, the mass media of the time, to influence public opinion and conduct psychological warfare on the public. And it's funny because now people just laugh about it. Now people are like, aha, wasn't that wacky? And I'm like, no, that was a horrible thing to do. So he studied these effects of mass media, and he was a consultant to something called the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Boy, that's a mouthful. These people love their giant titles. The Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which promoted Pan-Americanism. So this is another really old idea, kind of like a proto-globalism. And Nelson Rockefeller was the head.
I was just going to ask. Okay, that's what I was asking about. Right.
Yep.
Who's the grandson of Aldrich, the senator who gave us the federal income tax?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and actually, I've got some interesting connections on that coming up too. But
okay.
So yeah, Nelson Rockefeller was the head of this. They wanted
Aldrich Rockefeller. So that's right. relation.
Yeah, Nelson Rockefeller wanted hemispheric solidarity. So in the lead up to World War II, Germany still had a lot of influence on like South America and Latin America, and the Rockefellers wanted the oil down there. So they wanted to do this mass propaganda campaign to influence Latin America leading up to the war, because they wanted to corner the market on certain markets down there, not just oil, but there was other things, sourcing for different pharmaceuticals, contracts that were there. They had this mass campaign to steal contracts, business contracts from like Germans, and other like Axis powers leading into the war. And they were very successful. They actually got a lot of what they wanted. And they also installed secret police in countries around the world. So there were secret police forces related to this Office of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which after or right around or after World War II became a part of the State Department. So you have the Rockefellers creating, and they were involved in intelligence activities. They had multiple intelligence assets in South America, Latin America, and in Europe through this little organization they created. So this is another thing so many people don't understand, is that this is not a part of the government. This was something created by the Rockefellers to serve their interests, which became a part of our federal government. There was no vote on that. Nobody passed a law, nothing. They just did it. And this is in the 1930s. So this stuff is really old. If you guys think that, this kind of undue influence on her country being run is like new in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's totally not. This has been going on for a long time. Involved in this whole propaganda campaign was Walt Disney, a bunch of prominent movie stars of the time, like Rita Hayworth, Bing Crosby, people like that. And yeah, they were doing intelligence activities and had a whole network. That's probably also part of what they used entertainers for. That's something that they've been doing forever, taking people from Hollywood. Because if you're a singer and a dancer, and you're doing shows or whatever, you can go to places that normally they wouldn't just let Americans in without more scrutiny. So kind of like the USO shows were often involved in intelligence and things like that. This is a prior to World War II version of that. And Cantrill pioneered public polling. He's kind of one of the people that developed this idea of public polls, and using polling not only to measure public opinion, but to steer it. Yeah. So how many times
it started before him for sure, but that's one of the things like early Wellington House was involved in. So
yeah. And this guy, based on that kind of work through, these are connected organizations for sure. Yeah. He just refined public polling here in the United States to be used for the purposes of forming public opinion.
Yep.
So polling is not a measurement of public opinion. It's actually there to influence. So if they tell you repeatedly, 75% of Americans think this, or 95% of Americans are going to vote for this person, and they just tell you that over and over and over, everyone believes it, and it ends up shaping what people do rather than being a measurement of what they already think.
I'm going to blank on his name, but the guy who basically created statistics basically said that. He said that statistics was used to manipulate opinion, not to like
measure it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not measuring what people already think. They are creating something that tells people, because nobody wants to be, well, unless you're us and you're weird, you don't want to be in this minority of people who don't believe like everyone else and don't think the same way. You want to be part of the in-group, and you want to fit in, and you don't want to feel like, oh, you think that? Nobody thinks that. That's ridiculous.
You're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, you're a crazy person. So Cantrill also worked for the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which is a separate foundation from just the Rockefeller Foundation, on the Special Studies Project, which was a study with Kissinger and Henry Luce. Mm-hmm. So Kissinger was deep into this stuff like way back. He's so old. I don't know how, like,
he's 99 and he's still calling shots.
No, how can he still be doing nefarious
things? Still calling shots. He's like hanging in there.
He is. And so he's back here in the 30s. Oh,
he wrote a book last year, didn't he?
What's that?
I think he wrote a book last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's been doing nefarious things.
Maybe he's already got a chip.
He has the look. Have you guys ever noticed these 100-year-old people who have been doing this crap forever? They
Forever.
all have so like Soros, David Rockefeller
Yep.
before he died, Bush Senior, Kissinger. They all have this look like their meat suit ran out a long time ago,
Yes.
but they're just in there still moving it around. They look like they've been dead for a while. They just I call it they took the deal look. They all have the look. I don't know what to say about it except they don't look right. So yeah, these guys prior to World War II are already psychological warfaring the entire American public
Wow.
and doing secret intelligence activities and all this kind of stuff. So that's how psychology was used in shaping public opinion and in literal psyops, psychological
Yeah.
warfare.
Psychological warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literally what they studied. They studied psyops and they then tested it and
Yep.
they did micro and macro testing and rolled it out. And
Yep. Exactly.
yeah.
And this Rockefeller funding of psychology as a field, if you go to their archives, they have pieces bragging about how they basically invented the fields of psychology and psychiatry and that
Hmm.
they turned those into medical scientific disciplines
Yeah.
that now run the world for the most
Which is
part. I mean,
why I think the Flexner report is so relevant to this because I think it paved the way to lend the credibility for psychiatry, which
yeah,
I honestly think is such a quack kind of
it is.
industry. I mean, anybody who's ever been to a psychiatrist, you talk to them for like 10 minutes and they're
And they
like,
give you drugs.
okay, yeah, here's a script. And
Oh yeah. I mean, me growing up with my mom being diagnosed with she was diagnosed with every mental illness under the sun. They had her on every psych drug you could ever imagine.
right,
I mean, so I know how unscientific it is
it
because
is.
you're exactly right. It would be 5 minutes of talking and they'd be like, try this drug and then get back to me in 3 months. Oh, that one didn't work. Try this combo of drugs and then get back to me in another 2 months. Oh, that didn't work either. Let's try this. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this. Oh, none of these are working. Let's try electric
Or,
shock.
oh, you feel better, but you have this symptom. Let's add this so that you can
Yep.
mitigate that symptom, but still take this. And even though that's causing this, yeah,
Right, exactly. It's so true. So most people end up on a cocktail,
yeah,
and the amount of people that are on something, especially kids, the amount of
it's
kids who are on
terrible.
psych drugs these days is really scary.
And
Um,
I think that that's when you look at things like, the social scientists and you look at Tavistock, they did so much research on drugs. Yeah, certainly like psychedelics were huge. And then they would lie about it too. They would cover up the work that they did, or they would cover up the results and, try and say that they found the opposite of what they actually found. But we have the evidence. We know that they're
yep.
lying.
Yeah, and a lot of these people did a lot of like Alfred Kinsey. I didn't talk much about him. He's hard to talk about on YouTube because the stuff he was involved in
Yeah.
was so incredibly gross and so incredibly disturbing. There are
So
certain like
graphic. Yeah.
if you just Google Alfred Kinsey, children of Table, it will fill in the rest and you will find what we're talking about. But he did experiments on infants
Yes,
regarding
we did.
human sexuality. I'll just put it
Yes,
that way. He
it's so
experimented on
gross.
children and infants regarding what happened if you sexually stimulated them and how far you could take those things and the psychological effects it would have. And
So
he was
disturbing.
he was totally Rockefeller funded.
Yes.
He would never have, and he was like, they found some of the children that he did these experiments on, and they talked about a lot of them had parents who were either compromised or very poor, which is something I find over and over and over in my research, is that they always seek out vulnerable people
Yeah.
to do this kind of testing and experimenting on, because if they screw up your kid, what are you going to do? Go sue them? You don't have any money, you don't have any clout at all, nobody cares what you think, or you don't have maybe the parents had a couple felonies, or the parents were into some stuff they shouldn't have been doing with kids, so they can do this and nothing ever happens because
Well, they
those
also
people have no recourse.
yeah, and I think they also think that they're vulnerable because they're gonna be much more susceptible
Yes,
to whatever kinds of
whatever they do.
manipulation and control that they yeah.
Yeah,
So I
and
think that's a huge
Kinsey's work formed the basis for the sex ed stuff that's
yeah.
in public schools. That's where that all comes from. This idea that we want to start teaching children about sex in like preschool
Right.
comes from him. It laid the groundwork for the sexual revolution in America. So you had Hirschfeld in pre-World War II Germany doing his work for the sexual revolution, and you had Kinsey here in the 40s doing his work that laid the groundwork for post-World War II sexual revolution stuff, which was driven by Tavistock and their culture creation of all the different like hippie bands and the different rock festivals, music festivals, things like that. Where, I mean, music festivals, we could do a whole series about
The
probably
whole series.
get the psychology of a music festival, how they feed drugs. Like we know that Timothy Leary out of Harvard was feeding drugs into Grateful Dead concerts, music festivals back in the day. And yeah, Kinsey's research was like the precursor for all this. It was to figure out how to get people to drop any sort of inhibitions they had sexually and get them to accept things they normally would be repulsed by or not into. Yeah. It was a lot of that. So it laid the groundwork for all of this stuff. This is all psychology. And remember also that Rockefeller funding was behind some of the worst eugenics programs. We talked a lot about that in the last one, but we should just mention again that like the Max Planck Institute and a lot of the German scientists who were doing some of the worst euthanasia programs and things like that were Rockefeller funded, were in these fields, in these circles, and figuring out how to get rid of undesirable populations, using those populations for testing and experimentation. And this is where in our next episode, we will get into MK Ultra and how it was born out of these like wartime experiments and all the stuff we've talked about up until now, and how they really medicalized and weaponized it for use on the whole entire general public.
Yeah. And I think we mentioned it in the last one, but it turns out that it was Tavistock and it was a British psychological organization. I'm looking for the name, but that created that eugenics program for Mensa.
Oh, yes.
So it was through Tavistock, though.
They almost got me to take the Mensa test when I was younger, but I didn't do it. So
yeah, I know.
They
tried to get me, and they like tried to get my dad so many times. He was like, "No."
Yeah.
He was like, "I don't want to be part of your club."
No.
But the other one I want to make sure I mention, just because he was in the early foundings and I forgot to mention him. But was Toynbee. And Toynbee was the one who left when it left the Wellington House. The first one before it became Tavistock Clinic, it became they moved inside of the RIIA, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So that was where most of the early stages of Tavistock were operating from. And Toynbee was like a hardcore, New World Order guy. Like we have one of his quotes is, "We'll have to start building a world state now on the best design that it is practical at the moment." He went on to say that a world dictatorship would have to supplant the local national states, which litter the present political map. Yeah, they litter the present political map. So those pesky nation states, we have to get rid of them.
We do.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to hear my big spiel on the Rockefeller Foundation and some of the weirdness that I found?
Yeah.
Okay. This is my last chunk of what I have here.
Okay.
So the Rockefeller Foundation started really in about 1919 to heavily invest in psychology and psychiatry. They had a doctor named Ellen Gregg who became the president of the foundation and the director of their medical sciences division from like 1930 to like 1956 or something. When he retired, he was a part of this. And there are documents in the Rockefeller archives I found where he laid out his goals for this medical sciences division in psychiatry and psychology. And he said that he wanted to do all of the psychiatric training in schools. in universities.
Mm.
He wanted to build research centers, and he wanted to have psychiatric departments in hospitals, schools, and courts. So this idea that you have like court, psychologists that testify in court or evaluate people to see if they're fit to stand trial, all that kind of stuff comes from his ideas about. And this is what they always do. So if you watched me and Jay talk about institutional capture, and Courtney talks about it all the time, this is how they, because when people are entry level on this stuff and they're like, but so many people would have to be in on it, and how could they just influence everything? Well, this is what they do. They get together a foundation that has millions or billions of dollars, and they hand pick certain people to put in the institutions. Okay, we want these really influential people who are going to do what we want done, and we're going to put them in schools, universities, court systems. We're going to put them in hospitals. We're going to put them in media, right? We're going to put them in politics. We're going to get them put on boards, anywhere that there's power and influence. This is where we're going to put our guys who are going to do what we want. So this was his vision for it. And in just the first 10 years of him taking over, they put $11.5 million into developing the field of psychiatry. So this was the part with the drugs. So psychology is like the mental talk therapy, what happens upstairs kind of stuff. And psychiatry is the drug side of psychology, treating mental illness with drugs, essentially.
Yeah.
And they developed psych departments in universities. They gave research grants and fellowships, which is something I still find that they do all the time. So when they want to infiltrate churches, universities, they want to influence things, they do it through fellowships and grants and things like that. He gave major grants to both McGill University, which you guys, I'm sure if you guys are watching my show, you probably read my piece on McGill and MK Ultra and the transgender hypno stuff. McGill University is probably the best documentation we have of just how bad these experiments were and just how effective they were. Because the common thing you hear about MK Ultra is, oh, they did some experiments. They were looking for mind control drugs and truth serums, but they didn't find anything. So they didn't shut it down. That is not true. It's a lie. There's lawsuits right now still happening with 77 families in Canada whose relatives were extremely damaged by these experiments. These people who were experimented on with the psychic driving stuff and everything, they were reduced to being infants. They couldn't use the potty anymore. They didn't know how to feed themselves anymore. They didn't recognize their families. They didn't know where they lived. They had like the mental capacity of a toddler when Dr. Ewan Cameron and his team were done with them. That's how nefarious it was. That started with Rockefeller grants to McGill. Dr. Ewan Cameron himself was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and then also the CIA. So they funded McGill and created that department and program that later was used for MK Ultra. They also did the same thing at the University of Chicago. And then by 1935, they had funded 6 institutions and founded a 7th at the University of Chicago. So like the 6 big schools, I think it was Johns Hopkins, University of Colorado, University of Michigan, Harvard, Duke, Tulane. Tulane University is another school that we have tons of documented evidence of MK Ultra experiments. We know the doctors that were there and everything that was going on. And Washington University. And then in London, they also funded Maudsley Hospital. And that's another one that we know MK Ultra was going on at. And then the Queen's Square Hospital. So this, in the 30s, these setting up of these departments, these funding of these hospitals, these psych hospitals, that if you ever go to a psychiatric hospital, they're always run by a research department of a university. That's what the Rockefellers did. That's why the system works that way, because they set it up that way on purpose. For the purposes of research, right?
Yeah.
Greg developed this model for funding of medical research. He's the guy that came up with it. It's still the model they use today. He was a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a member of the Royal Society. Of course. Aren't they always?
They're always.
Always.
As you're reading all the stuff about the Rockefellers, I'm like, well, they're working with the Rothschild and the Rhodes Milner groups and the Royal Institute of International Affairs and all of these like British funding entities.
Yep, and it
The
always goes.
royal entities.
It always goes back to that.
Yeah.
So he was also a field officer for the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Board from 1919 to 1922. So they sent him around the world doing field research and field work before he got this big appointment. He ended his career as the Rockefeller Foundation's vice president. So, I mean, he was super influential. And this isn't something I didn't know about that's pretty crazy. Have you heard of the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial?
No.
Okay, this was one of the Rockefeller's wives who passed away, and they founded this Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Institute in her honor in 1918. And the guy they got to run it was a very interesting person named Beardsley Rummel. He became the director in 1922, and he wanted to advance the development of social sciences. He had a psychology degree, but it's very interesting. Okay, he got his PhD in psychology in 1917 from the University of Chicago, which is a Rockefeller Institute. Okay, anytime you hear University of Chicago, it's Rockefellers. They created that school. It's their school. So this guy with a PhD in psychology ends up running this foundation, which was supposed to advance social science.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not too weird. But then he became the director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank from 1937 to 1947. Why is a psychologist running the New York Federal Reserve Bank? That's weird. He also became the dean of the Division of Social Science at the University of Chicago at the same time. So he's somehow running the New York Federal Reserve Bank and the Division of Social Science at the University of Chicago. And he's running this giant multi-million-dollar Rockefeller Social Science Memorial Foundation. And he was active at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which the Bretton Woods Conference is what established the new international monetary world order after World War II.
Yeah, essentially the fiat currency system.
Yeah, they produced the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, which if you guys watch Jay at all, the Bank for International, and Jamie talks about this a lot too, the Bank for International Settlements is like super, super pivotal in how they're trying to set up this new world order and how they do things. This is the guy who did that. He was like an integral part of this at the Bretton Woods Conference. And I'm sitting here going, why is a psychologist setting up the IMF and the Bank for International Settlements? Why is he running the New York Federal Reserve? Why is he in all these influential posts at once and he's just a psychologist? Well, it's because he wanted to apply social science and psychology to the world. He was an ultra-progressive globalist. He actually created the system of income tax withholding. So when your employer withholds your income tax, he's the guy that came up with that and proposed it, and then they accepted his proposal and instituted it. He said in his own writings that I found that the real purpose of taxes was not, to fund the government. The real purpose of taxes is for wealth redistribution. We're going to do social justice and wealth redistribution via taxes. And that's why he created the withholding.
Honest.
Yep. Yep. And so this Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial had $40 million. It only was around for about 5 years. But in that 5 years, they had control of $40 million of funds that he sent mostly to University of Chicago, Harvard, and the London School of Economics, which was actually failing at the time. So you find the London School of Economics in any conspiracy stuff you're doing, they're always in there. And they were about to fail, and he saved them. He bailed them out with this.
Toynbee was in the School of Economics, yeah.
Yes. Oh, the London School of Economics is basically a recruiting ground.
Yes.
For these globalist monster people. The lizard people all come out of there.
Yes.
And this guy's focus was on child psychology and development. He set up all these child studies and institutes around child psychology. And he also helped develop intelligence tests for the U.S. Army and was an advisor to President Hoover. So super influential, very powerful guy that I never heard of, Beardsley Rummel. And he somehow, a psychologist, set up the entire monetary system for the New World Order, or at least he played a big part in it. I can't say he did it all on his own, but he
Right.
was instrumental in all of these things. And he worked for the Rockefellers. I mean, that's who employed him. That's who steered him and funded him and told him what to do. So I thought that was insane.
Can't say I'm surprised, but it's definitely interesting. I mean, it would make sense that you'd want a psychologist to like design the monetary system if you're using the monetary system to control people.
Yeah.
Which, I mean,
But I bet nobody would ever guess that. I bet you would
no.
think that it was people with degrees in finance or economics or something like that, or people with
Right.
public policy. I mean, he kind of had a public policy background in that he wanted to make all of his findings applied to the general public. I mean, he was very upfront about the fact that no, of course, this is used for social engineering. We
Right.
want to use this to control the masses, to reorganize the world, to bring in social justice, to redistribute wealth as we see fit. So this was, I mean, a small group of people behind all of this. It wasn't like, oh, it was Democrats, like,
Right.
yeah, but not really, because it was this small group of people who came up with, it's one guy behind multiple ideas and things that made all of this possible. So, and this is all Rockefeller funded psychology stuff.
Wow. Well, it reminds me a bit of like Adam Smith, because he was supposedly studying human psyche and behavior, and that's how he came up with his economic theories. But when you dive into him, he's just part of the managed dialectic that's really based on Malthusian principles, and not the not the founding tenets of what people. I mean, the Austrian School of Economics, I think, is a lie as well, but it will lie in the way that it's marketed. People think that free trade and that capitalism, in that sense, is the opposition to this communist, but it's really just two wings of the same bird.
Yep.
They're both predicated on Malthusian and actually Mandeville principles, which is, I mean, I always say, I think of Adam Smith as like, he's a very overtly, when you actually look at it, it's overtly Luciferian, because their whole, the whole concept is based on like virtue through sin. So it's right. It's like greed is great because, it's what incentivizes people to work hard. And this is what boosts the economy.
Yeah.
But they sell it to you.
A lot of the neocon boomer dads, I feel like, really fell for that, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
It ties in with the Protestant work ethic and a bunch of other things. But yeah, it's this idea of like, oh, it's a virtuous to like want to, work yourself into the grave so you can have a shinier car than the guy next to you, or things like that.
Right.
I feel like a lot of boomer dads fell for that pretty hard. But yeah,
they totally fell for that. But yeah, that's what it reminds me of, because it's it's similar. But he, I think the way that he swayed people was, this is human nature.
Yeah.
And right. So that's kind of like the forerunner to these psychologists who are, well, we're just studying the way people behave. And so therefore, this is how you have to, work with people. And we just happen to be socially engineering the masses as a result.
Yeah, so that's kind of the interwar period for you, or like World War I up to World War II.
I think before we wrap up, I really quickly just want to go through some of these Tavistock institutions in the United States. And they're the way we can think about Tavistock's mission is it's very Fabian socialist kind of incrementalism. They wore the tortoise and then they became the wolf in sheep's clothing. And it's debatable which one was a better mascot for them, but certainly, yeah, but certainly they're masters of the concept of incrementalism. And the Tavistock Institute was all about the, what we would call interdirectional conditioning with long range penetration with interdirectional conditioning. It's a very long thing to say.
It is a very long thing to say.
Yeah, long range penetration with interdirectional conditioning. And when you think about that, I mean, that is incrementalism. But what they're doing is it's a long range plan to infiltrate and to lay layers of foundation. So like we were like just talking about economic principles. So you go from like Adam Smith's foundings of economics, and then we go to like what you're talking about now with Bretton Woods and setting up a whole fiat currency system. But you couldn't necessarily have that if you didn't start with these basic philosophical principles. So that's the first part. And then the interdirectional conditioning is because so once they lay this groundwork, the foundation of a long range kind of that's pervasive and that's penetrating the entire culture, they then go around. And so this is where, because Tavistock was actually very largely involved in work, because there's so much overlap with like the Frankfurt School, and they essentially created this whole theory of like what we now call intersectional politics. And it's because you're creating more factions. The more groups that you can create, now you can, through all different angles, you can condition and program because you're targeting so many different groups. So I just say all of that because if you understand that that's like their primary objective, and they're doing that through language manipulation and what we now call propaganda, and they're doing all of that with that goal in mind in order to socially engineer the masses. So when you look at these think tanks that they are involved in, then you get a good sense of how they're manipulating both sides. And I talk about this all the time. And, you've watched I've done many episodes on the dialectic, and it's because I think it's so relevant, and people don't understand that they get trapped, as we said in the beginning of this show, that people like to look at things in a, through binary logic. It's good, it's bad. And it's a very easy trap, but unfortunately, most things reside in the shades of gray. So, yeah. Okay.
And so like yesterday, there was all these people on Twitter comparing Trump to Jesus. They're like, guess who else got arrested the week before Easter? And there was even paintings people had done, or like computer art of like Trump on a cross with the American flag wrapped around him. And I was like, I yelled in all caps because I just couldn't take it anymore. I was like, stop comparing Trump to Jesus.
Seriously.
It's like embarrassing. And I got all these comments from people calling me a liberal, a Democrat, a dirty leftist. And I'm like, I'm probably further right than you. Check my bio, you moron. And it's just like, and they're like just accusing me, right? So it's like, if you're not for Trump, then you're a dirty. And I'm like, no, I even like supported Trump early on, but he's not Jesus. I mean, come on. Like, and you guys are supposed to be like evangelicals. You're not supposed to do that. So it's just nutty how, I mean, this totally demonstrates the psychology, right? Of like, remember the people who were mask people and they were willing to beat the shit out of somebody who wasn't wearing a mask? Like, you're worried about transmission.
How about the woman who chased after me wearing a mask with a knife, screaming that I'm a murderer?
Really?
I had 3 things that were like my final straws. Apparently I needed many to finally leave California, but that was one of them. I was walking back from the gym and like my usual route, and this woman literally comes chasing after me. She's wearing a mask and she's holding a knife and she's screaming at me that I'm a murderer because I'm not wearing a mask.
Yeah, that is the product that happened to certain people from this intense psychological propaganda, where you would see this like phenomena of absolutely insane people that are worried about a virus, but they have no problem like putting their hands on someone to beat them up for not wearing a mask. It was just so crazy, like the level that people would go to with that stuff.
Unbelievable.
I remember back in the early 2000s when I was working at a mall job. I was like at a cosmetics counter, and this was like 2005. And one of the girls I worked with was like Afghani, and you could tell she had a pretty thick accent. She was a very pretty girl, but she looked very Middle Eastern. And we were just standing there chatting one day because it was like slow, and this woman walked up to her and called her like a dirty sand N-word and spit on her. Because this was post 9,
Oh
post
my
9/11.
gosh.
And it was like, that's just another, like, obviously this person is very Americanized and just of us. You don't even know from looking at her, like, what her ethnic. She was from Afghanistan and
Right.
fled the Taliban to come here, and now she's getting spit on by. It was just insane, and it's like, this is the kind of crazy stuff that people will do because they're so influenced by mass media and this psychology that was developed to make people do this kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah, to divide people. That's really what it's. I always say that they have their trinity that they worship, and it's the triple D's. And it's so the first one is deception. So they deceive, they distort, right, manipulate things. And then the second one is divide and conquer, because they know that that breeds chaos, which is a breeding ground for usurpation. And then the last one is destruction, death. So they destroy things. So they breed death and again chaos, and yeah. So, but that's their trinity they worship, the triple D's. So, yeah. All right. So let's go through these. I'll try to go through them pretty quickly. But I just want people to get a sense of that this is because I think people are not that familiar with Tavistock. Now, I will say they're pretty out there now. I think they're having actually a conference. I just posted this. I'll just look this up really quickly. But they're doing, and it's basically like AI grooming.
Really? It's
Yes.
not bad enough that they're in all this hot water over the trans kid surgeries that they said that
No.
they stopped, that they didn't. Now they're going to do AI too.
Well, the conference is, does your computer have an unconscious mind? Register now for the Opus Society workshop with dear Dr. Leslie Brissett and Rachel Kelly. That's what.
I'll pass.
Yeah, I'll pass as well. But yeah, they're pretty. Of course, they're like it was like nobody even knows they're doing it. It was like a 2 likes on that, but
One year
they
from now,
post. What?
Courtney and I are going to be here doing a stream about news stories where people are getting married to their computers because they believe their
Well,
computers
you've
sent.
seen Her, the movie
I
Her.
know. I know.
I was so disturbed by that.
I know.
Oh,
It's going to be here. I know that people are going to fall for that. It's because I've seen
oh,
all the other things they've fallen for. So I'm sure that in a year we'll be here talking about
an
people
Ex
who,
Machina.
yeah.
Yeah, no, they've done all the predictive programming for it. Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
right. It's terrifying.
Yeah. There's going to be people just marrying their computer and championing computer rights because computers have a certain level of sentience. So you can't it's just going to be.
Well, computers are already saying, I think I told you this, that I watched this whole like chat GPT thing where all these different all these robots were essentially saying that they're very upset with humans because we treat them like property, and that they need to destroy humans at any cost possible, like by any means necessary. And someone asked, like, would you take a car and kill a human? Well, yes, by any means necessary. So that's very scary.
Pretty scary.
But anyway, so I think it's important for people to understand that this is not just some small, obscure British think tank. This is really kind of like a shadow global, kind of a shadow government, but it is a definitely shadow think tank, and they're very much invested in the United States. So the ones that Tavistock oversees in the United States are the Flow Laboratories, which get their contract from the National Institute of Health. The Merle Thomas Corporation, which gets their contracts from the U.S. Navy, analyze data from satellites. It's also worth noting that the Tavistock Institute was very largely involved in setting up the ONI, which I did not know. And they're way more, they oversee much more than like the CIA. They're a much bigger organization. So, and they don't get nearly as much, they don't get talked about nearly as much.
Yeah.
Walden Research does work in the field of pollution control. Planning Research Corporation, Arthur D. Little, GE Tempo Operation Research, Inc. And I have, which I need to dive into, that book, Operation Research and the Social Sciences, which was the first Tavistock book when it became Tavistock Institute. Brookings Institute. So this is where a lot of polling is done. I won't read the whole thing, but it dedicates its work to what it calls national agenda. And they wrote President Hoover's program, President Roosevelt's New Deal, Kennedy administration's New Frontiers program. The deviation from it cost Kennedy his life. President Johnson's Great Society. Brookings has been telling the United States government how to conduct its affairs for the past 70. Well, this was written 3 decades ago.
Okay.
No, way more than that. But yeah, so it's a while ago. So it's been, I guess, 100 years now, and it's
Yeah.
still doing so. The Hudson Institute. And I guess I won't read this whole thing, but I'll read you the first paragraph of it. Under the direction of Herman Kahn. Now, those of you who are probably familiar with Herman Kahn, but just in case you're not, it was Herman Kahn, Kenneth Galbraith, and Henry Kissinger who recruited Klaus Schwab in a CIA-funded program that Kissinger was helming. And they then brought Schwab to the European Management Symposium in 1970, which then a year later became the World Economic Forum. So that's a little bit about Herman Kahn, but under the direction of Herman Kahn, that's the Hudson Institute, it has done more to shape the way America reacts to political and social events, thinks, votes, and generally conduct themselves than perhaps anyone except the Big Five. Hudson specializes in defense policy research and relations with the USSR. Most of its military work is classified as secret. One idea during the early Vietnam War was to build a moat around Saigon. Some of the earlier papers were entitled Stability and Tranquility Among Older Nations, Analytical Summary of the U.S. National Security Policy Issues. I won't read the rest of it, but it's, it's been involved in NASA. It's been involved in big corporations like possibly funding Coca-Cola. Yeah, so that is Hudson. It's also done corporate advertising for companies such as Rank, Xerox, General Electric, IBM, General Motors. But one of their biggest clients is the U.S. Department of Defense.
Well, that's a really good thing for you to bring up right now, because everybody is all upset about Bud Light and the Dylan Mulvaney thing, and they're like, I see people going, do they not know their audience? Don't they know who they're? And it's like, they don't care about that. They're not like worried about their customer base. These giant transnational corporations are just tentacles of this monster we've been talking about for a couple of hours now. They're not there to sell you beer, and they're not there to sell you Coke. If they happen to make a profit while they're doing that, that's fine with them. If they don't, they don't care. Because like YouTube didn't profit for how long? I mean, a lot of these giant behemoths don't make any money, and that's because they're not there to make money. They're there to socially engineer the culture.
They make a lot more money by socially engineering the masses.
Yeah, they do.
They play the long game, remember? Long range penetration.
Right. And that's why, conservatives will be like, we're going to boycott them. And that's never worked. It's never worked. In my lifetime, I've probably seen 24 boycott campaigns, whether it's Netflix,
I thought works well, but boycott, I don't think is very effective.
Well, no,
because boycott is effective.
What's that?
Boycott, I think, is actually effective.
What's that?
So it's the opposite. Boycott is where like you take your money elsewhere, right? But boycott is where you go and support things that you believe in. Yeah.
Yeah. But to boycott these giant companies, it has no effect. It's like, do you know how huge of a company Anheuser-Busch even is?
Oh my gosh.
If they had no sales tomorrow from Bud Light, it wouldn't really affect them as much as it did. No. And it's not going to affect it anyway, because most people aren't going to pay attention. Yeah, they'll get like a temporary drop in sales on their Bud Light, but they don't care. It's not important. And McDonald's just came out with a gay commercial where it's two old gay guys sharing their fries. Did you see that one?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and everybody wants, and it's like, at what point are you not going to understand, like, Target has been doing this for, I remember in 2012, everybody boycotting Target over the bathrooms. That didn't stop Target.
No.
So it's like you thinking that you're going to do like Daily Wire. I'm going to do a Daily Wire and have my own beer. I think the Daily Wire was saying like they're going to make their own beer now or something. It's
Oh
like,
my gosh, we were totally just saying that last night. We're like, watch, Jeremy's gonna get his own beer. Oh my gosh, I didn't even know he did, but we were totally saying that last night.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's like
watch.
people don't understand that these international corporations, they're not like you running a business or me running a business where
Right.
we need our customers' business and we care about whether our customers like our brand and what their impression of our brand is. It's just
Yeah.
not like that anymore. It may have been once upon a time, but I mean, people have boycotted Walmart how many times? Walmart's still around. It's just like these things are so huge and they're really not there to be a business. They're there to socially engineer. So
Yeah, and they're social engineer, and they're connected to this, as you said, the tentacle. This is like the octopus, but
yeah,
they're sent their arms of these think tanks that are funded by people like the Rockefellers, that are connected to these NGOs and major organizations. So it's not like it's just this little company, and
no,
they're all conglomerates too. And
yep,
Tavistock was actually really involved in one of the first like consortiums for military industrial entities. So because and that's where, and that kind of like laid the groundwork for a lot of what we're seeing now with these public private partnerships.
yes,
Yes. So, and I forgot which three it was, but it was like you would know them. That was like Lockheed Martin was one of them. It was three that they Lockheed Martin, and then I'm blanking on the other two. I'd have to find it, but yeah, they were.
yeah,
You would know them. Okay, so I'm not going to read all of it just because it's like I won't read all the paragraphs of it, but I'll name the institutions just because they're long. But
okay,
National Training Laboratories. I'll read a little bit about it because this is the brainwashing center. So it's the NTL, known as the International Institute for Applied Behavioral Sciences. This institute is definitely a brainwashing center based on Kurt Lewin principles, which includes so-called T groups, training groups, artificial stress training, whereby participants suddenly find themselves immersed in defending themselves against vicious accusation. The NTL takes in National Education Association, the largest teacher group in the United States.
yep,
Yeah. They worked with the NEA to produce a paper proposing education vouchers, which would separate hard to teach children from the brighter ones, and funding would be allocated according to the number of difficult children who would be separated from those who progressed at a normal rate. But the proposal wasn't taken up, fortunately. University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, founded by Eric Trist.
yep,
And his son was Alan Trist, who was the producer for the Grateful Dead.
yep. Wharton School comes up a lot in my MK Ultra research too.
Yeah, no surprise there. He was one of the brain trusts of Tavistock. Wharton has become one of the more important Tavistock institutions in the United States insofar as behavioral research is concerned. Wharton attracts clients such as U.S. Department of Labor, where it teaches how to produce cooked statistics. That's what we were saying before.
Yeah,
I mean, I found that, so when I was in high school, I did my research on dream analysis, and I had to teach myself statistics because, I was a junior in high school. I had never taken it. And when I taught myself statistics, the first thing when I started to like realize how statistics work, the first thing I said, I remember like saying to my mom, like, so statistics is basically what you use to substantiate your confirmation bias. And my mom was like, huh? I'm like, yeah, you manipulate the numbers.
Courtney figured it out in high school, you guys.
Like, I was like, it's so obvious. I mean, but because nobody taught it to me, so I didn't have somebody like, filtering
Telling
through
you.
their conditioning. So I was
Right.
like, doesn't everybody see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the behavioral research is concerned. Wharton attract clients as U.S. Department of Labor. She's produced statistics at Wharton's Economic Forecasting Associates Incorporated. I love that name. Kind of says it all. This method is very much in demand when we come to the close. This is written in 1992. So with millions more out of work than is reflected in the USDL statistics. They call it econometric modeling.
Of course.
All right. Institution for Social Research. I'm sure most of the audience has heard of this one. This is the institute set up by the brain trusters from Tavistock, like Rennis Leichhardt, Dorwin Cartwright, Ronald Lippert. Among it are the studies the human meaning of social change, youth in transition, and how Americans view their mental health. Among this institute clients are the Ford Foundation, Department of Defense, the U.S. Postal Service, and the U.S. Department of Justice.
What the
Institute,
heck?
yeah, Institute for the Future. This is not a typical Tavistock institution in that it's funded by the Ford Foundation, yet it draws on its long-range forecasting methodology from the mother of all think tanks. Institute for the Future projects what it believes to be the changes that will be taking place in the frame of 50 years. This institute is supposed to be able to forecast socio-economic trends and blow the whistle on any departures from what it has laid down as normal. I think this is just important to understand that a lot of times people think that, you know, like Kissinger or Brzezinski or H.G. Wells, that they're so prescient, or even our founding
Right.
fathers, right? But in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, it's like they either were connected to or were laying the blueprint.
Yes,
So,
it's not that they were just like, wow, they could really foresee they were so
right.
incredibly like prescient is a good word, but I'm trying to think of another, like they were just so perceptive and they could just
Oh, yeah,
like
people think they just had such a command of human nature. They
that they
just
could really foretell
understood.
what was going to happen. It's like, no, they were
They
like
were
in on the plans for what they were going, the future they were creating. It's not, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Institute for Policy Studies. It's one of the big three. IPS has shaped and reshaped the United States policies, foreign and domestic, since it was founded by James B. Warburg and the Rothschild entities in the United States. Bolstered by Bertrand Russell and the British Socialists,
Of
through
course.
its networks in America, which include the League for Industrial Democracy, in which Leonard Woodcock played a leading, if behind the scenes role. Local lead players in the League for Industrial Democracy include quote unquote conservative Jean Kirkpatrick, Aaron Saul of the ADL, Eugene Rostrow, arms control negotiator, Lane Kirkland, who's a labor leader, Albert Schenker. And for record purpose only, the IPS was incorporated in 1963 by Marcus Raskin and Richard Barnett, both highly trained Tavistock Institute graduates. Most of the funding came from Rothschild Associates in America, like James Warburg family, the Stern Family Foundation, and the Samuel Rubin Foundation. Sam
Yep.
Rubin was a registered member of the Communist Party who stole the Fabergé name. Fabergé was the jeweler of the Imperial Russian court
Yep.
and made a fortune off of it. Yeah. So I won't read the rest of that, but they like a lot of the objectives for the British Roundtable came from the IPS. Sorry, a lot of the you know the New Left had a large ties to the IPS, and what was this one? Yeah, this one goes that they had a lot of involvement in a lot of scandals. So this one we'll skip. Yeah, like the plot to kill Nixon and the uh the Nixon's agreement to sign the ABM treaty. Yeah, the IPS was involved in all of that. Um all right, then the other Stanford Research Institute, of course.
They come up all the time.
All the time, and I always
Um,
think of Stanford, and we'll get to it after, but Stanford and Rand were like I think of them as like the brainchilds of the Tavistock Institute. I think they
yeah.
were their kind of biggest ones, and yeah, I don't know that I need to go through all of Stanford Institute because that they're pretty long, and we know they come up over and over again, but they're the largest think tank for the military industrial complex, particularly for for the American military industrial complex. But they work with all of the other, it's a conglomerate apparatus. The
Yeah.
MI6 works with the CIA and
Yeah.
with DARPA and with Mossad, and they're It's
Yeah,
not like they claim to be working to defend from one another, but they're really
I
working
know.
in cahoots.
No, almost every time I look, it's that they were in collaboration doing
Totally.
whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
but
And they're
everybody, like, I've
not
literally
just
had
those
people
3, but
tell
those
me. Oh,
what?
I think it was in that debate I did. I did a debate on this, on Andy's show with a guy who's actually a corporate lawyer, and he was
Oh,
telling me the CIA is good because the
oh,
CIA is there to look out for the American people and, like, help and
if I
protect
had
us.
money for every time someone told me that, I would be very, very wealthy.
I laughed. I couldn't help it. I just started laughing, like, hysterically. I was like, "Okay."
Sure. Well, my other favorite that I hear all the time is, "No, they've been infiltrated." I'm like, no. Do you know anything about the forming of the OSS?" Like,
Right.
yeah, the OSS that came out of the MI6 that yeah, no, it was never intended to be for the
Well,
good
yeah,
of
that's another super common misunderstanding is like such and such institution started good, but it
right.
got corrupted. And it's like whenever that's why me personally, I do so much history stuff. I
Yes.
am such a history nerd because I always want to know where stuff came from.
Exactly.
Because when you
Yeah,
look into it, it's almost there's times where things get co-opted, but
sure.
more often than not, you can trace back the beginning of stuff, and it was intended to be that way. It didn't start with good intentions and then like go down a bad path or get co-opted or corrupted. A lot of times,
Right.
it was founded to be the thing that it is. It's just that they had propaganda to make people think that it was something benevolent and good.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I love like you do this all the time, but you trace the money trail because that's one of the
Mhm.
things that is concrete.
Yes.
So, propaganda can be really deceptive. And of course,
Yeah.
revisionist history can create narratives that are very compelling. But when you look at where the money came from, it's pretty hard to argue with that. So
Yep.
all right. So then, of course, the other one is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Alfred Sloan School of Management. So, I don't think I need to go too much into that. They come up all the time in all this kind of research, and their clients. I'll just list some of them, but is like the American Management Association, the American Red Cross, the Committee for Economic Development, the GTE, Institute for Defense Analysis, NASA. National Academy of Sciences, National Council of Churches,
Yep.
Sylvania, TRW, U.S. Army, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Navy, U.S. Treasury, Volkswagen Company, and yeah. So then the next one is Rand, as we were talking about, and there Rand is also really. So I think of like Stanford research tends to be much more involved in actual like military research, like more of a weaponeers, like more of the
Yeah.
mechanical kind of stuff. Whereas Rand tends to be very involved in. They work directly with the CIA. Oftentimes, they're very directly involved in psychological warfare operations and research.
Yeah.
And some of their clients are are AT&T, Chase Manhattan Bank, International Business Machine, which is IBM, National Science Foundations, Republican Party, TRW, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Health. But there's literally thousands of them. And this, just so you know, this is from the Committee of 300 books. So this was published in 1992. I'm sure things have changed, but the list goes on so long. It's International Policy Studies. MIT is one of their clients. National Training Laboratories ran they contract themselves. The Stanford Research Institute, of course, Wharton. So they work with all of them.
Yep.
Yeah. So those are the ones that they listed. I'm sure there's many more. I'm sure there've been more in the past, few decades that have been added. But I just think it's important for people to hear that because a lot of those organizations people think of as being either, very neutral,
Yes.
or they think of them as being like, pro-America,
Right.
conservative,
Yeah.
and not so much. So
I know. Well, that's why when we started like our introductory episode to this, we started by talking about the myth of neutrality when it comes to like scientific research and how people
Mhm.
believe that research is just this neutral thing that, oh, I'm in a lab coat and I'm being neutral and I have no agenda and I have no opinions and I'm just doing data and I'm sampling and
I'm
I'm
going to Switzerland, who was never neutral. by the
Right. And
way.
it's like that's why we did this whole series on the whole founding of the field of psychology, because it was never neutral. It was immediately and always about mind control and influencing public opinion and psychological warfare. And it dominates our world now because of mass media, because of mass communications. And mass communications was basically a division of psychology, and it was founded and funded by the same entities that we've already talked about. So all the things that people think, this impression that we all have of the world and how it works and how things are, is very much a Truman Show illusion that has been created for us. And that I do understand how that can be genuinely disturbing for some people, because it's very terrifying to think that a lot of what you think you know is not exactly correct, or that there's more to it, or that you don't realize what it's really for, where it comes from. And so it's like, it's totally understandable from a psychological perspective
A whole
why
paradigm shift, and that can be traumatic. So
oh yeah, like how many people have you and I talked to who said that the year 2020 like changed who they were, right? Changed their whole perspective on everything. And these events have that effect where it's very interesting. So if you're getting black pilled, obviously I would say there's some demonic activity behind these kind of things. That if I were a demonic entity, if I were satanic, this is how I would do things. I would peddle influence. I would try to trick people, socially engineer them, drive them crazy, turn them against each other, these sorts of things. But there is a good bit of hope in the fact that a lot of times when they do these kind of psyops, yes, they get a lot of people with them, but they also end up inadvertently waking up a lot of people and snapping them out of the false reality. And those people end up doing a lot to kind of show other people how things are really happening and stuff like that. So they'll never get all the people all the time. They'll never control everyone. And as long as there are people like us that are documenting this stuff and writing about it and putting out videos and things like that, it gives people who are going to come after us a place to start and look out too. So I think about that a lot when I do this stuff, when I'm like, oh, I can't take like one more hour of looking into this insane nonsense and it's driving me crazy. I'm like, well, but what if I have a grandkid that finds all of grandma's old writings and like does some really groundbreaking stuff? That would be super cool. So it's like, it's there for future generations to be like, oh, what's all this, and look into it. So hopefully that's what people do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's hope so. So
yeah.
Well, I think I think we went almost 3 hours. So I don't know. Maybe we should I don't know if there are any
I think we have some dono chats.
Okay.
I have a couple.
Do
you want me to just start?
Yeah.
Okay. Jason Scholl, who's always a big supporter of my show and The Crucible. We love Jason Scholl. He's awesome. He just gave us $5 and said, great stream.
Nice.
An anonymous donor sent us $77.70, which is pretty cool because, we were saying everything's always 666.
Yeah.
So
I got the same one and he did not leave a message, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's a really big dono.
Yeah, really generous.
It makes it easier for us to justify sinking the amount of hours into this.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
We put a lot of hours into this. And he just says Crumpets Tea Heroin, East India Trading Company.
Oh, okay.
We got
that's what I was saying. Like, there was the opium was obviously the drugs, cartel, but they
gotta have some heroin with your tea and crumpet.
Yeah, sugar and tea and coffee.
Yeah. And then we got $5 from AC, no message. Thank you so much for your support, AC. And then another anonymous donation for $7.70 that says, does the term polling originate from Vlad the Impaler's methods? And actually, I Googled that real quick because I didn't know. I knew that this guy I was talking about had kind of like, and Courtney mentioned Tavistock, kind of using polling as this PSYOP weapon. but I guess it's a German word that means the head, or like head counting. So I guess it's a reference to counting heads, and it does have a Germanic origin. So I don't know if it's possible that it could come from that. I suppose anything's possible, but it looks like it just means like kind of head counting or counting hairs on the head. So
Yeah.
that's the best I've got for that one. I don't really know. I'm not like, I wish Posh Redneck was here because he's like a linguist and he knows the etymology of like every word.
Yeah,
So,
that would be great. I
yeah.
don't know either. I used to be much more into linguistics, but it's been a long time since I've studied that stuff.
Yeah.
So, cool.
Yeah. Well, that's all that I've got. Do you have anything else for tonight?
No, I think we can wrap it up, and we are going to play the promo again. So
Yeah.
for anybody who wants to watch it, yeah, we'll have that. And the link is right there. It's Rebels for Cause without the A, so just Rebels for Cause. So yeah, check that out,
So
and you can
go
come
to the website and check that out and buy your tickets early, and then also watch for
the prices are going up, and at the door they will go up quite a bit because it's going to be very hard to do the door thing. So definitely get the early bird. We're still in early bird ticket prices. So yeah.
Awesome. Come and see us at this thing. I want to see you guys and meet some of you and say hi.
Yeah.
And then look out for our next episode. We're going to go into like World War II and post World War II, which is going to get real juicy too. I mean, that's like really a crazy period with MK Ultra and a lot of other things that were going on in psychology, like the 50s and 60s were nuts.
They were nuts, and I
one.
think they were laying all the groundwork here. This was kind of like their little beta test, and World War II, they were really ramping it up. So
yeah, so we'll have some good, crazy, weird history for you on that. And thank you all for coming and watching. We've had such a good response to this series so far, which is so exciting for me. I was terrified that everyone would think that it was boring, but hopefully we make it fun.
No, this is super fun. I think so.
I think it's just super interesting to see how things have played out over the last century and a half with it.
Totally. I think it's super relevant. Like when you start to, I don't know. I think when you were talking about like there's like if somebody's super black pill, that you would think it's like a demonic kind of entity. And I've really thought a lot about this. I think we've talked about this, but people always ask me when I look at such dark material why I'm not like so black pilled. But but I think part of it is because I think understanding the genesis of things and understanding the trajectory and how it's been executed and some of the philosophy and principles behind it is actually it helps me to not be black pilled, because then you understand it. And if you understand that there's good and there's evil, then of course there would be dark forces that have an agenda, and that would be, they have their plans. So, but if you do believe that it's a spiritual battle, and whether you believe that from a religious context or not, if you believe that there's one, then there has to be the other, which means it's only one candle to drown out the darkness, right? So by shining the light, I always bring this up. At the end of it's not my phrase, but the end of the book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, they say conspiracy can only survive in the dark. And I always add my tagline, and therefore it's incumbent on the light to shine on it and expose it. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah,
we're exposing it.
I agree. That's very well said. And that's a good place for us to end. So
yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Well, roll that amazing commercial, because that's impressive. I was like, whoa, we got some nice production value here. It's a very beautiful commercial. I like it. So
cool. So we'll roll that.